Haute couture, we must begin by saying, is not a mood nor a mood board, not a vibe nor the gauzy residue of a runway clip circulating on social feeds. It is a legal category, a sovereign jurisdiction within fashion's loose confederation, the rare case where language hardens into law and law curates a liturgy of craft. High sewing becomes a proper noun only when a maison submits to, and is anointed by, the French federative body that guards the term and the ritual calendar around it. Ateliers in Paris, petites mains on payroll, collections presented on time, garments cut and reborn through multiple fittings until the cloth behaves like biography. Couture is therefore not simply expensive. It is exacting, custom-fitted, and rule-bound, an agreement to let technique become destiny, and destiny to be staged twice yearly as a civic ceremony for fashion's republic of connoisseurs. The point is not exclusivity for its own sake, but exclusivity as a method of seeing. When measurement becomes attention, and attention becomes care, and care becomes the only ethical response to the human form, its asymmetries, its histories, its hopes, then we are in the domain that the Fédération de la Haute Couture et de la Mode has preserved with bureaucratic devotion and cultural ferocity. To name haute couture is to invoke an infrastructure of standards rather than a cloud of adjectives, which is why the phrase remains both protected and productive, a legal tightrope that forces houses to prove, season after season, that the pinnacle has not dulled into a plateau. But definitions are always negotiations, and to define couture merely by statute would be like defining a cathedral by its building permit. The letter explains how the stones rise, but not why the nave makes us whisper. So let us risk a more demanding account. Haute couture is the slow violence of precision against the entropy of generalization. Ready to wear generalizes. It must, to clothe a demographic. Couture particularizes. It must, to dress a person. The toile is not a mock-up. It is the first philosophy, the thought experiment in muslin, where the house demonstrates a belief that bodies are not deviations from a pattern, but patterns in their own right. When the premiere marks a dart, she inscribes a thesis about posture and power. When seam allowances are hand-finished, they become arguments for intimacy as infrastructure, the inside of a garment carrying an ethics of what the eye is not meant to see, but the wearer is meant to feel. This is why couture's cost is not a price so much as a proposition. That attention, multiplied over hours and hands, can be transfigured into comfort, authority, and aura. The aura is not mystical. It is cumulative. It is the knowledge that a sleeve head was eased by someone whose craft includes time as a material, that the lining is not an afterthought but a second skin, that the hem holds a secret weight so the skirt reads like a sentence with proper cadence. Couture's custom fit is therefore a political act disguised as a technical practice. We pretend it is a luxury so we can speak about it safely, but beneath the embroidery runs a nervous system of claims about personhood. To cut for a specific body is to affirm that bodies deserve specificity. To schedule multiple fittings is to concede that self-knowledge arrives iteratively. To adjust a neckline because the client prefers a different measure of revelation is to model consent as design. The dress becomes a constitutional document, negotiated, ratified, amended. If pret-a-porter encodes the market's dream of scale, couture encodes the atelier's ethics of concern. This is not to romanticize wasteful opulence. Rather, it is to insist that the extremity of craft can sometimes clarify the baseline of dignity. In the hands of true houses, excess is not an end, but a method for thinking through form. What would it take, Couture asks, to make a garment that refuses to treat you as a category? And then it answers in the grammar of bias cuts, hidden stays, and a choreography of pins. Of course, couture must be regulated because the word tempts inflation. Without law, every evening dress would masquerade as haute, and every showroom would baptize itself an atelier. Regulation here acts like discipline in a studio class. Constraint increases invention. The Chambers criteria, Paris atelier with staffed competencies, the twice-yearly showing, the custom commission, the fitting sequence, do not suffocate creativity but scaffold it, the way classical meter forces a poet to discover new turns of thought. We routinely misunderstand rule sets as fences when they are, for masters, ladders. A maison climbs by obeying, and in the ascent learns which conventions can bear the weight of innovation. This is how we arrive at those apparent contradictions that define couture's modernity. A dress whose inner corsetry could have been drafted in 1950 cradles a bodice whose surface is a galaxy of hand-applied micro-sequins achieved with contemporary optics. A jacket that respects the liturgy of canvas and pad stitching opens to a lining quilted like a poem about comfort. Tradition here is not nostalgia, but tension. An elastic that, when stretched, stores energy for the next precise snap forward. We should also admit that couture's economy is not primarily transactional. It is ecological, in the sense that each show and each commission reshapes the habitat through which the rest of luxury moves. The cliché says couture is a loss leader, a halo. The truth is subtler and more structural. By gathering artisans, stabilizing crafts, and demonstrating what fabrics can do when asked the right questions, couture fertilizes the upstream of the value chain. Mills will attempt a jacquard woven at a density no mass client would underwrite. Embroidery houses will prototype a technique whose cost per square centimeter sounds like a misprint. Pleaters will coax permanence into folds that ignore humidity's tyranny. These experiments do not remain quarantined on the runway. They metastasize benignly into ready-to-wear accessories, even window displays, and store architecture. What you call a halo the supply chain recognizes as R&D, what you call spectacle, the ateliers quietly tabulate as pedagogy. When the camera watches the bride exit in the finale, it is not watching a single look. It is watching a guild system teach itself how to remember. The suspicion, naturally, is that couture is aristocratic pageantry pretending to be art. But the pageantry is an alibi for the seriousness of the work. Luxury names a frequency of attention more than a class of objects, and couture is that frequency tuned to its upper register. Consider the hand, not the metaphorical hand, but the literal hand that learns to thread a Luneville hook blind from beneath the frame, to feel tension not as force but as eloquence, to count not stitches but micro-decisions in a square centimeter of cloth. When you put on such a garment, you do not put on opulence, you put on coordination, between eye and needle, between tradition and trial. This is why the interior of a couture piece must look as inevitable as its exterior. Inevitability is design's highest compliment, the feeling that nothing could be otherwise because everything has already been thought. And thinking, here, is manual. If the definition is rigorous and the craft is devotional, why call haute couture the pinnacle? Because a pinnacle is not merely the highest point, it is the point from which the horizon rearranges. Couture's influence on the broader luxury market is not a trickle-down of silhouettes alone, though silhouettes do travel, sometimes smuggled by hem lengths, sometimes paraded by proportions. So much as a circulation of methods and metaphors. The bag that becomes a bestseller borrows its hardware proportions from couture's sense of scale. The sneaker that multiplies waiting lists learns its color story from the chromatic courage in a January show. The perfume that pays for the show in a way the show refuses to speak about borrows its narrative sincerity from a couture collection's ability to stage a thesis without speaking a word. In other words, couture gives the brand its philosophical accent. Even a house whose ready-to-wear is ruthlessly commercial will soften its consonants after a season of watching fabric behave like argument and embroidery behave like inference. Yet couture's exclusivity forces us to face the question of justice. What does it mean for the most caring form of dressmaking to be accessible to the few? There is a real sting here. No sermon will dissolve it. And still we can say that maintaining spaces where technique is not compromised is not a sin against democracy if those spaces function as archives and laboratories for everyone else. An architecture school's research pavilion does not house the city, but its innovations shelter the future. A couture collection occupies a similar logic. If ready-to-wear is the city plan, couture is the experimental structure that proves new spans are possible. The responsibility then is twofold. Houses must translate what they discover into humane ready-to-wear, and the industry must build apprenticeships so that the knowledge stored in quiet hands does not go extinct. Without that pipeline, haute becomes a mausoleum. With it, haute becomes a school. Let us press further into the ethics of fit, because this is where couture's rhetoric risks devolving into romance unless we keep it argumentative. A bespoke garment fits in ways that go beyond circumference and length. It fits anxieties. The first fitting is often a rehearsal of self-presentation. Does the body wish to be simplified by line or dramatized by volume? Does it ask to disappear into matte or announce itself in sheen? What does the client fear about the mirror that a dart could rephrase? If you think this is melodrama, watch a muslin do diplomacy between a back's tension and a shoulder's memory of slouching through long days. A good premiere reads posture like subtext. She will raise a waist 1 centimeter, not because the tape measure commands it, but because the client's breath belongs to a different key. This is psychoanalysis by Chalkmark. The garment becomes a conversation in which the cloth learns to tell the truth the client can wear. The atelier, in this reading, is both workshop and court, where tradition pleads its case against novelty, and novelty cites precedent to justify its trespasses. Separate workrooms, flue for the soft, tallure for the structured, do not merely divide labor, they stage a dialectic between drape and architecture. When the two converse, couture discovers its most articulate sentences. A jacket whose internal canvassing carries the authority of tailoring, but whose sleeves collapse into a kindness only the flue can teach. An evening dress whose upper register is architectural in its discipline, while its skirt speaks the liquid grammar of bias. The best houses are bilingual. They think in structure and dream in flow, and the interpreter is always the cut. Then there is the show, which cynics call marketing and houses call mass, and both are right. A couture presentation is a public liturgy of private virtues, a way of letting the city overhear what the workrooms whisper. The staging is never innocent, sets as arguments, music as thesis, pacing as syntax. But when it succeeds, it does not distract from clothes. It tunes the room to the garment's native frequency. This is why the final look is often coded as a bride. Not because every collection is about marriage, but because the finale proposes belief. Do you now believe that fabric can mean this much? And houses use the bridal form as a vessel for that last persuasion. The cameras record, the clients annotate, the ateliers take notes that look like sketches of gratitude. The next day, the quiet begins again, which is to say the real work resumes. Measuring, cutting, basting, questioning. Regulation returns here, not as paperwork but as pulse. Without a shared calendar, January and July, there is no drumbeat to keep the craft in time. Without the designation, there is no line between aspiration and appropriation of the word haute. Without standards, there is no guardrail to keep houses from eroding the practices that justify their prices. If you are tempted to resent the bureaucracy, consider how many endangered crafts survive because couture guarantees their relevance. Embroidery houses do not endure on nostalgia. They endure because couture orders arrive that require an alphabet only they can write. Each commission is a referendum on whether a given technique remains legible in the present. In that sense, the chambre does not merely protect a category, it curates a commons, ensuring that when we say hand embellished, we are not using hand as a metaphor. The market predictably demands an answer. Why should the rarest expression of dress decide the mood of a mass luxury economy? The easiest reply is to point to the halo effect, media reach, red carpet logic, and the aspirational ladder, whereby a lipstick sells the dream a gown made visible. But I prefer a harder thesis. Couture disciplines imagination. When a house has to persuade fabric to do what it does not wish to do, and persuade the eye to accept forms it does not expect, the house trains itself to solve problems. Those problem solvers later sit in rooms where a handbag must feel inevitable, where a sneaker must reconcile comfort with ceremony, where a storefront must naturalize desire. A culture of exacting problem solving, learned under the pressure of seams that cannot be unseen, leaks outward, and it is this leak that irrigates the rest of the brand. The halo is not glitz, it is governance. We must also let the critique breathe. Couture can console itself with ideas while ignoring the planet. This is intolerable. The honest defense is not that couture is sustainable because it is slow. That would be sophistry. But that couture can model a different arithmetic of value. A single garment kept for decades, altered, inherited, archived, and studied to teach future makers what human attention is capable of. That is not a license to waste, but it is a counter-proposal to fast novelty. Moreover, the experimental edge of couture, materials, finishes, digital tooling for visualization without sampling, can be aimed at reducing harm upstream. The choice is not between hand and future. The choice is whether the future will learn to respect the hand. When a house invests in apprenticeships instead of branding alone, when it funds the last pleater to train the next pleater, when it rejects a cheaper shortcut because the seam will not live well, that is environmentalism in the grammar couture understands. Care over time. Influence, law, ethics, craft, all of these are scaffolds, and still we have said little about silhouette, which is the first sentence the garment speaks before the wearer says a word. Couture's silhouettes matter because they are arguments about proportion and power staged at life size. The new look's cinched thesis, Balenciaga's volume as counter-rebuttal, Chanel's ease as manifesto. These were not trends, but propositions about how the body relates to space and gaze. Contemporary couture continues this debate. Architects of fluidity against engineers of structure, mystics of translucency against realists of mate. When a house chooses to obscure a waistline, it is not indecision. It is a refusal to let the viewer fix the wearer to a geometry of seduction. When another carves a waist like a parenthesis, it is not capitulation. It is a considered entry into an ancient conversation. The importance is not which side wins. It is that couture keeps the conversation literate. And then there are the hands again, always the hands, because they are where theory must become seam. Watch a bound buttonhole made by someone who has done 1,000, and you will see the paradox of mastery. The 1,000th must be the first for this cloth, in this weight, at this exact point in the warp and weft. Expertise here is radical attention, the refusal to let habit become a shortcut. Couture depends on that refusal. It is how the inside of a jacket becomes a cathedral of small decisions, how a hem becomes an essay on gravity, how a sleeve cap becomes a thesis on motion. If this sounds devotional, it is because devotion is what keeps the unnecessary necessary. No one needs a hand-worked buttonhole. Everyone needs to live in a world where someone still knows how. If you demand the industry diagram, the sociological map of why Paris remains the axis and how global capital keeps the carousel spinning, you will find the same truth under different names. Standards rehearsed until they feel like destiny. Stages used as laboratories, clients treated as collaborators rather than consumers, and craft described not as heritage, but as method. Haute couture represents the pinnacle not because it sits above, but because it sharpens beneath. It refines the edge on which every other category cuts. Remove it, and the rest of luxury grows blunt. Keep it vigilant, and the rest of luxury remembers its first language. Attention paid until meaning appears. So we circle back to the beginning. Not a mood, not merely a market, not even a museum. A jurisdiction, guarded and generative. An ethics of fit articulated by chalk. A politics of particularity smuggled into silk. A pedagogy of hands. A discipline that turns law into ladder and spectacle into school. One could say this is too much to ask of clothes. Couture answers that we have been asking too little. Haute couture's origins are not just the birth of a style, but the invention of an entire system, and at its center stands Charles Frederick Worth, an Englishman who moved to Paris in the mid-19th century and transformed the very meaning of fashion design. Before Worth, dressmakers were largely anonymous artisans, executing garments according to a client's wishes, adjusting silhouettes to existing norms, and rarely signing their work. Fashion was understood as collective taste filtered through seamstresses, milliners, and court culture. Worth, however, introduced the radical idea that a designer could be an auteur, a creator whose vision shaped what women should wear, rather than a passive executor of client demands. His salon on Rue de la Paix in Paris became the prototype for the couture house, a centralized atelier where design, presentation, and client relations fused into a new cultural model. Worth's innovations were both technical and theatrical. He pioneered the practice of presenting seasonal collections on live models, known as mannequins at the time, inviting clients to view designs in motion before ordering made-to-measure versions. This transformed clothing into performance, staging fashion as an event and not merely a transaction. He also insisted on signing his garments with labels, making fashion operate more like art, where authorship and brand identity mattered as much as the garment itself. In doing so, he elevated the status of the designer to that of a cultural authority, initiating the shift from craft to art that defines haute couture's mythology. The couture house as a concept began here, a maison that consolidated ateliers of specialized workers, tailors, embroiderers, drapers, and finishers, under the direction of a singular creative force. Clients, often aristocrats and later wealthy bourgeois patrons, came not only for garments, but for the aura of belonging to a circle defined by exclusivity and artistry. Worth established rituals we now take for granted: seasonal collections, the intimate salon show, and garments built for individual bodies through multiple fittings. In this sense, the couture house was a hybrid of workshop, gallery, and theater. Early developments in the industry reflected the rapid urban and social transformations of 19th century Paris. The city under Baron Haussmann became a stage for spectacle, and the emerging department stores like Le Bon Marché created a new consumer culture. Couture operated alongside this system, but defined itself by its difference: handmade, custom, intimate, and rare in an era of industrial acceleration. Worth's success inspired other designers, Paul Poiret, Jean Paquin, the Callot Sœurs, to establish their own maisons, gradually forming an industry where creativity was institutionalized. By the 1860s and 1870s, haute couture was synonymous with Paris itself, anchoring the city's global reputation as the capital of fashion. This moment was also about labor organization. The petites mains, the little hands who executed the delicate stitching, were as essential as the designer's vision, and the house structure formalized their role within a hierarchy. Worth's atelier functioned almost like a guild, preserving artisanal knowledge while also creating an economy of prestige that depended on craftsmanship invisible to outsiders. Thus, the origins of haute couture are inseparable from the rise of the atelier as both a workplace and a cultural symbol. In short, Charles Frederick Worth's role in mid-19th century Paris marks the decisive shift: fashion as authored, houses as institutions, and couture as a system that combined art, theater, and commerce. The early couture industry was not only about luxurious dresses, but about inventing a modern way of thinking about fashion, as narrative, as authorship, as exclusivity, and as law-bound identity. It is from this soil that haute couture grew into the legal, cultural, and aesthetic pinnacle it represents today. Let us begin with a provocation. The 20th century did not merely carry haute couture across a calendar of styles. It placed couture under trial again and again, demanding that a discipline born in salon intimacy prove its relevance to cities in revolt, to economies unhinged, to wars that rearranged the moral geometry of matter and time. To speak of milestones, then, is not to plot a museum tour of silhouettes. It is to reconstruct a history of resilience under pressure, a chronicle of how the couture house, an organism of hands, rituals, and rules, learned to metabolize social change without surrendering the premise that clothing can be an authored art practiced at the scale of the individual body. We will move restlessly through the century, through the 1910s of uncertainty and the 1920s of velocity, through the austerity of the 1940s and the unblushing optimism of the 1950s, through the iconoclasm of the 1960s youthquake and the pluralism that followed, through the corporate consolidations of the late 20th century that paradoxically conserved couture by commercial logics that lay outside it, always asking how the atelier answered history not with slogans, but with seams. The century opens with a pair of paradoxes: the rise of mass culture and the intensification of singular craft. On one side, magazines, photography, and department stores refract and multiply desire. On the other, the couture house doubles down on the ritual of fitting, staging privacy as a luxury precisely because publicity is proliferating. Early modernists in couture, Callot Sœurs with their irreproachable fleu, Jean Paquin's refined pragmatism, Doucet's lyricism, operate as laboratories in which fabric studies the body's newly accelerated life. But two forces name the decade's argument: Paul Poiret, who emancipates the waist and binds the ankle, teaching Paris how scandal can be silhouette, and Mariano Fortuny, whose pleated mythologies propose that antiquity can become modern simply by treating cloth as memory rather than armor. Already we see the century's logic: couture as an archive that writes the future by rereading the past; couture as a theater where the body rehearses roles the city will later normalize; couture as a workshop whose true commodity is attention in a distracted age. Then the 1920s, that fever dream of syncopated optimism, arrives with a scissors in one hand and a stopwatch in the other. Couture shortens, lightens, and clarifies. Gabrielle Chanel's insurgency is not simply the myth of Jersey. It is a philosophy of subtraction, an ethics of utility that treats embellishment as a sentence that must justify each word. Her little black dress is not minimalism so much as the refusal to allow color to perform femininity on behalf of the wearer. Her suits propose that ease can be authority. Her costume jewelry announces that value is not a metal, but a mood. Across the street, Madeleine Vianney builds a different modernity. The bias cut as a grammar of continuous curves, a method that replaces the tyranny of darts with the courtesy of diagonal drape. If Chanel writes in prose and asks you to speak clearly, Vianney composes in music and invites your body to sing. Between them stands Elsa Schiaparelli, who will crest in the 1930s by inviting surrealism into the workroom, lobster prints, trompe-l'oeil sweaters, shocking pink, demonstrating that wit can be a form of structural integrity when it is supported by cut. The roaring world consumes these propositions voraciously, but look carefully. Couture is not merely following speed, it is studying speed to discover where slowness will still matter. The 1930s stage, the first major test, economic contraction and geopolitical dread. It is easy to tell the story as retreat into elegance, but that is misleading. Couture in this decade experiments with durability as a mode of grace. Schiaparelli's collaborations with Dali are not fripperies. They are arguments that symbol can armor psyche. Chanel's tweeds quietly develop a social thesis: softness as self-command, comfort as refusal to be bullied by the day. Vianney's ateliers continue refining bias techniques whose technical difficulty is an austerity of exactly the right kind, lavish time invested in economy of seam. Meanwhile, Hollywood develops its transversal logic, sending Paris silhouettes through the projector and returning Paris profits through global desire. Evening glamour on the screen becomes daylight aspiration in department stores, and couture, still private, discovers it now lives inside a mass dream. The house label begins to function as a passport across mediums, and the couturier learns the modern lesson of licensing, perfume, and narrative, less halo than governance. War tears the thread. The 1940s divide into scarcity and reconstruction, and in scarcity, couture must act like an ethical philosopher with a needle. Rationing forces invention. Shorter hems, fewer pleats, improvisational closures, the tailoring of resolve. The atelier becomes not a sanctuary from politics, but a site where dignity is cut against constraint. The decisive pivot comes after 1945, when regulation formalizes what had been custom. The Chambre syndicale codifies haute couture as a protected category, setting conditions that are at once pragmatic and metaphysical. An operating atelier in Paris, a minimum staff, the presentation of collections twice yearly, and garments made to measure through fittings for private clients. Law here does not fossilize creativity, it erects a scaffold against dilution. With the term haute couture guarded, the house can claim that its attention has a legal name, that craft has standing, that the cost is not caprice but compliance with a tradition rendered explicit. Post-war regulation is the architecture enabling a renaissance. That renaissance has a proper noun. Dior, 1947, the new look. It is a mistake to reduce the revolution to wasp waists and acres of cloth. What shocked was not excess but optimism, a silhouette whose wasteful-seeming fullness was actually a political wager that there would again be enough fabric, enough patience, enough ceremony, to dress the future generously. Dior's tailoring, Bohan's later refinements, and the contemporaneous majesty of Balenciaga's volumes established the 1950s as couture's operatic decade. Coats that are cathedrals, suits that are sentences without adjectives, evening dresses that carry weight like gravitas rather than like burden. Clients reappear with pent-up appetite. Ateliers rehire and retrain. The show returns as liturgy. But beneath the swish of skirts, another current gathers: the industrialization of ready-to-wear, the export of the Paris mood into American sportswear and Italian confection, and the quiet anxiety that bespoke ceremony may lose the argument to democratic convenience. The 1960s call the question, and they do not ask politely. Youthquake is not a hemline phenomenon. It is a philosophical challenge to hierarchy. Courrèges and Pierre Cardin, we could argue about how couture they remain in the strict sense, electrify the air with geometry, synthetics, and space-age clarity, proposing that the future is not hand-worked, but precision-engineered. Across the hall, Yves Saint Laurent invents a paradox that will sustain couture across the chasm, couture that quotes the street. The Mondrian dress translates modern art's grid into cloth. Le Smoking, that tuxedo for women, transfers the liturgy of tailoring to a new priesthood, female sovereignty in a suit cut for authority, not for disguise. Saint Laurent also executes the high-wire act of launching Rive Gauche Pret-à-Porter, tacitly acknowledging that couture cannot pretend mass desire does not matter, while insisting that couture's job is to maintain the source code. The decade hurts couture, yes. Clients defect to ready-to-wear, apprentices drift toward design schools and advertising. But the damage is instructive. By surviving a generation that claims clothing should be easy, couture learns to articulate why difficulty matters. The 1970s consolidate the compromise: couture as halo, as archive, as school. Hubert de Givenchy shepherds aristocratic restraint into relevance by designing ease with lineage. Emmanuel Ungaro orchestrates color and movement with a virtuosity that reads as sincerity rather than show. Saint Laurent's couture remains the temple, even as his ready-to-wear pays the electricity bill. The Battle of Versailles in 1973, ostensibly a charity showdown, exposes another truth. American sportswear's speed and swagger can puncture French ceremony, yet both systems crave each other's gifts. The French need the American sense of present tense. The Americans need the French discipline of cut. Couture digests the lesson by opening itself, slightly, to the possibility that exuberance can be tailored and that theater is not the opposite of rigor, but one of its more demanding forms. Meanwhile, regulation evolves to keep pace. Standards are reiterated, membership policed, invited members and correspondence acknowledged, the calendar protected, the term haute couture kept meaningful by the friction of compliance. The 1980s arrive in a limousine and a spotlight, and the prevailing critic's story, excess, misses the complexity. Christian Lacroix's pouf is remembered as flamboyance, but its structural cunning is a love letter to construction. Thierry Mugler's heroic tailoring is read as camp when it is, at heart, an anatomy lesson in power. Jean-Paul Gaultier's transgressions are catalogued as provocations when they are methodical inquiries into gender as a cut rather than an essence. Most decisively, Karl Lagerfeld at Chanel and across town, Azzedine Alaïa in his own self-contained constellation, demonstrate two models for couture's late-century life. Lagerfeld performs responsible archaeology, unearthing codes, camellias, chains, quilting, and reanimating them yearly in a style that teaches the house to be fluent in its own language. Alaïa, meanwhile, rejects the tyranny of the calendar and returns the body to the drafting table, proving that a dress can be both glove and sculpture if the hand that makes it studies anatomy without illusion. The decade crowns the creative director as both historian and futurist, an office that will become both salvation and trap. The 1990s fracture into opposed yet interdependent impulses, maximalist spectacle that turns the couture show into Gesamtkunstwerk, and minimalist severity that attempts to flush effect from form until only proportion remains. John Galliano's theatrical appointments, to Givenchy briefly and Dior decisively, convert couture into historical fiction staged with forensic detail and extravagant poetry. Alexander McQueen's tenure at Givenchy, though stormy, injects British angst into Paris technique, a reminder that savagery and refinement are not antonyms, but accelerants. In counterpoint, Jill Sander in Ready to Wear and Helmut Lang's cool austerity exert their moral pressure, forcing couture to justify every flourish with muscle. Martin Margiela, operating in the margins and later within Hermès for Ready to Wear, conducts an ethics seminar on deconstruction as respect. Seams revealed not to shock, but to honor labor. Repurposed materials elevated without irony. Artisanal line conceived as a catechism of handwork. Underneath the runway theater, conglomerates assemble, and we learn a cold truth that nonetheless saves couture. Perfume and accessories can underwrite the cathedral so long as the cathedral continues to teach. By the late 1990s and into the 2000s, couture enters its paradoxical golden dusk. Fewer clients but more cameras, fewer houses but louder voices, less immediate economic function but greater symbolic necessity. Regulation again proves protective. Under the Fédération, haute couture remains a juridical border, and invited members keep the blood fresh without draining the identity. Houses like Dior under Galliano and later Raf Simons oscillate between opera and haiku. Chanel under Lagerfeld perfects the art of building temporary worlds in which each collection's thesis can make sense. Givenchy, Elie Saab, whose evening wear monarchy speaks to a global clientele, Valentino under different regimes, And Armani Privé demonstrate that couture can still be a classroom where line is taught with patience. New geographies of wealth alter the client roster. The Middle East, Russia. The atelier adapts not by pandering, but by learning new rituals of modesty or spectacle, translating core techniques into different cultural protocols. Couture proves its universalism not by sameness, but by elasticity. Technology does what technology always does: threatens and then teaches. Computer-aided pattern making coexists with chalk. 3D printing flirts with ornament, and in the hands of Iris van Herpen, becomes a new species of handwork, where the hand is the intelligence that decides how a printed structure becomes wearable truth rather than museum joke. Laser cutting, digital embroidery files, and virtual prototyping reduce needless sampling while raising philosophical questions about what counts as handmade. The honest answer is not that the hand must touch every stitch, but that the mind of craft must govern every decision. The 21st century discovers that couture's job is less to refuse the future than to curate it, filtering techniques through a standard that asks whether the wearer feels more human inside the result. If the answer is yes, the method is legitimate. If the answer is only new, couture declines the offer. Let us rewind, because history is a braid, not a line. The post-1945 regulations deserve a closer look, not as bureaucratic trivia, but as an aesthetic constitution. By requiring a Paris atelier and periodic collections presented to the press, by stipulating a level of staffing that ensures a discipline of work rather than a hobby, by imposing the discipline of fittings that convert design into dialogue with a specific body, the rules enshrine a metaphysics. Fashion, at its highest, is not a sketch but a negotiation. The client is not a mannequin. The designer is not a sovereign. What the law protects is a process in which the garment becomes a record of attention paid over time, fittings as minutes, alterations as amendments, delivery as ratification. When the Fédération updates or flexes these rules to admit invited members, it is not betraying the ideal. It is recognizing that attention can be practiced outside one city so long as the city remains the grammar in which the attention is written. Social change continues to beat its drum, and couture answers by becoming the slow heart inside a fast body politic. Second-wave feminism reads the new look ambivalently. Liberationists suspect a return to containment, while others find power in ritualized femininity. And couture must accept that a dress is never only a dress. It is an argument about what a body may mean in public. Civil rights, decolonization, and the globalization of culture after satellite television expose couture's Eurocentric mythologies. The house learns to collaborate with non-European artisans not as exotic garnish, but as equal interlocutors. Lesage meets Lucknow, featherwork meets ostrich farms in South Africa. Pleating studios take cues from Japanese origami masters. AIDS tears holes in ateliers as it tears holes in the world. Couture's response is memorial and militant, staging beauty without apology, while supporting, sometimes quietly and sometimes flamboyantly, the structures of care that the state and market neglect. Every sleeve has a shadow. Couture learns to cut in light of that truth. Economics refuses to be silent, so let us confess the arithmetic. Couture sells very little to very few, and yet it persuades multitudes to buy what is downstream. The danger is cynicism. The house becomes a theater set for handbags, and the remedy is to protect the content of the play. When couture becomes truly empty of technical difficulty, the ecosystem senses the lie and withdraws the aura. When it remains technically ferocious, the ecosystem pays respect in the only currency conglomerates understand: brand equity sustained by substance. This is why a cleverly made-to-order coat that will be worn by one woman in Riyadh or Shanghai can influence the cut of a ready-to-wear blazer that will be sold in thousands. The coat is not a prototype, but a parable, a moral story about proportion and finish that buyers, merchandisers, and pattern rooms absorb collectively. Couture is not a business unit. It is an operating system. We cannot ignore the ethics of labor. The petites mains are not nostalgia. They are knowledge. The 20th century nearly allowed certain crafts to die: plumasserie, certain categories of tambour embroidery, the patience required for hand-padded buttonholes, and couture's stubborn insistence on technique saved them, not as antique hobbies but as living literacies. Apprenticeships within houses, the acquisition of specialist ateliers by conglomerates to stabilize cash flow, training programs that transmit tacit knowledge that cannot be codified in PDFs. These are milestones as decisive as any collection. The public sees gowns. The future will see that what was being made, above all, was hands capable of doing more than a machine can do, because a hand is a sensorium, not a tool. Each regulation that forces work to remain in Paris, each exception that allows invited members to keep a second home elsewhere, is a decision about where knowledge lives and how it migrates without dissolving. Couture's 20th century evolution also exposes a philosophical discomfort many critics prefer to sidestep: the problem of elitism. Is it indefensible to pour thousands of hours into a single garment while needs proliferate? It would be disingenuous to answer glibly. The honest defense is twofold. First, couture's scale of production is microscopic compared to mass industry. Its footprint is symbolic more than material, yet its symbolic gravity can redirect mass behavior toward better make, longer wear, altered and inherited rather than tossed and rebought. Second, couture preserves experimental spaces where the cost of failure can be absorbed by the halo economy of a brand, enabling research into techniques, materials, and fits that later make mid-market clothing more humane. This does not absolve hypocrisy. It argues for a stewardship model in which luxury is answerable to a public good, measured in knowledge kept alive, and dignity redistributed by example. We arrive late in the century at another hinge. Communications speed annihilates the conditions that once made secrecy part of couture's magnetism. Now every show is instant, every detail magnified, every mistake immortalized. The temptation is to escalate spectacle until clothes become souvenirs of staging. The wiser houses, and this is a milestone that cannot be listed by date, learn to harmonize mise-en-scène with method. A Lagerfeld supermarket set at Chanel may court headlines, but the jackets still contain their soft armature of quilting. A Galliano Egyptian fantasia may intoxicate, but the bar jackets still clasp the waist like a sentence whose clause has finally balanced. A Valentino lace reverie under Piccioli, drifting later into a politics of color and caste, holds together because the stitches never lie. The lesson is harsh. The camera is unforgiving, but truth is also photogenic. When cut is right, the lens confesses it. Let me return to the youthquake, because every subsequent decade is in dialogue with its insult. The 1960s told couture it was old. By the 1990s, couture had learned to be ancient in the way mountains are ancient, weathered yet exact. This maturity permits a generosity of style that defines late-century couture's pluralism. Maximalism and restraint coexist. Tradition and technology braid. Camp and classicism debate without bloodshed. This plurality is not indecision. It is the recognition that the only consistent ethic couture can promise is attention. Attention will sometimes sculpt a corset. Sometimes it will dissolve one. Attention will sometimes embroider for 1,000 hours. Sometimes it will refuse embroidery as a form of noise. The standard is not ornament, but honesty. Does the garment tell the truth about what it is and why it is as it is? If we chart milestones, then, we must name not only designers and silhouettes, but also institutional acts. 1947's New Look, as proof that war does not have the last word. The post-1945 codification of haute couture as a legal entity whose criteria secure meaning. The 1960s youthquake as a disciplinary crisis that forced couture to articulate its justification. The 1973 Versailles moment as globalization's rehearsal. The 1983 appointment of Lagerfeld at Chanel as the invention of the modern creative directorship. The 1997 arrivals of Galliano at Dior and McQueen at Givenchy as the restoration of couture's capacity for narrative risk. The late-century mergers that stabilized craft by attaching it to industries that could afford to protect it. But to list is to flatten. Better to say that the century trained couture to survive by remembering what only it can do. Cut time into fabric so that a body can feel what care weighs. The final contradiction of the 20th century is this: couture is at once the most conservative and the most radical practice in fashion. Conservative because it guards techniques whose destruction would impoverish us. Radical because it insists that the subject is singular in a world that would make us demographic. The century's convulsions, wars, depressions, liberation movements, technological coups, corporate empires, do not prove couture obsolete. They prove couture's thesis harder to defend, and therefore more necessary. The house as institution, part studio, part school, part theater, part temple, became the mechanism by which memory negotiated modernity. The show as ritual became the public-facing theology of that memory. The regulation as law became the secular scripture that kept language from slippage. And the garment as fit remained the sacrament. A person walks in, fragmented by the noise of history, and walks out wearing a sentence that says, with stubborn clarity, "You are particular and you are seen." We end the century not with closure, but with a choreography learned through adversity. Couture adapts by choosing its battles, innovates by protecting its premises, influences by refusing to dilute its difficulty, educates by turning secrecy into lineage, and justifies itself by making objects whose truth is felt before it is understood. The milestones are visible, yes, bias cuts and little black dresses, bar jackets and tuxedos for women, space-age geometries and lace cathedrals. But the real milestone is invisible. The persistence of a craft logic that believes attention can be a politics and care a form of knowledge. If the 20th century asked couture again and again, "Why should you exist?" the best houses answered not with press releases, but with sleeves that climbed the arm like arguments and skirts that negotiated gravity like treaties, teaching a rushed world that slowness, when intelligent, is not delay, but depth. Begin with the provocation that what we call an iconic couturier is less a person than an apparatus, hands arranged into an argument, ateliers organized into a grammar, silhouettes smuggled into history as if they were merely clothes. And from this angle, Chanel, Dior, and Balenciaga cease to be names on pedestals and become instruments for tuning the 20th century's contradictory longings: speed and repose, emancipation and ritual, modernity's clean line and memory's Baroque fold. If I sound confrontational, it is because the myth of genius obscures the more difficult truth that each of these houses invented a politics of attention. They taught fabric how to behave ethically with respect to a body, and they taught a body how to negotiate power with respect to a gaze. The signatures we can list: Chanel's jersey and the radical prose of her suit, Dior's new-look bar jacket and the liturgy of post-war abundance, Balenciaga's volume as counter-discourse to fragility, are not merely styles. They are theses about how a person should occupy space and time, and they quarrel with one another like rival schools of philosophy that nonetheless share a deep, almost religious devotion to craft as a form of truth. Take Chanel first, because her revolution arrives not as trumpet blast, but as subtraction, the kind of subtraction that feels scandalous precisely because it refuses the sentimental labor of ornament to which femininity had been conscripted. She does not merely borrow jersey from men's underwear drawers. She reclassifies the fabric from commodity to concept, proving that comfort can be a discipline rather than a lapse. The little black dress is not minimalism in the vacuous sense. It is a veto against color's alibi, a demand that cut and proportion shoulder the full semantic load without the crutch of prettiness. The suit, her suit, performs the deeper drama, quilting inside the jacket so the fabric remembers, chain at the hem so the line speaks in a low voice, boundaries soft enough to move yet firm enough to conduct authority. Here is the paradox of Chanel. She strips away to empower, but she is not naive about the theater of power. Pearls are stage lights, not treasure, and costume jewelry becomes a critique of value that is also a weapon of visibility. This is why her modernity persists. She teaches the wearer to switch registers, practical in cut, performative in sign, without apology, an early feminism of pragmatism in which ease is not retreat but readiness. And yet it is too easy to canonize her as emancipatory without remainder. If Chanel liberated the waist and simplified the day, she also perfected a uniform for a class that could afford to look unbothered. The serenity of her line assumes a stability the century did not grant to most. She is at once insurgent and conservative, the progenitor of a monkish luxury in which restraint is an index of power because it implies the option to indulge. The psychoanalytic reading would say she sublimated grief into control. Orphans learn to orchestrate surfaces so the inner turbulence is legible only to those who read seams. And the political reading would say she democratized an aristocratic posture by translating it into reproducible codes, tweed as pedigree without bloodline, camellias as heraldry anyone could wear. The atelier becomes her parliament. Petite's mains legislate comfort stitch by stitch, and the jacket becomes jurisprudence for the shoulders, teaching them how to hold a room without shouting. If she insists on authorship, she does so to protect a method. the belief that a woman's day should not be a duel with her clothes. Move now to Dior and feel the pivot from prose to hymn. The new look, 1947, is often misremembered as nostalgia, but what it really declares is that scarcity shall not have the last word. The cloth returns not to waste but to ceremony, as if the skirt were a public allocation of hope. To cinch the waist is not to imprison it, but to frame it, a rhetorical device by which the torso is given subjecthood and the hips are granted jurisdiction. The bar jacket is punctuation, the period that allows the sentence of the body to end with confidence. Dior's genius is not merely silhouette, but governance. He coordinates tailleur and fleu so that structure and softness cease to be enemies and become dialectical partners in the rhetoric of presence. Under the visible abundance lies a stringent discipline, interlinings, wadding, hidden tapes that turns the body into architecture without converting it into stone. And he is a cartographer of lines beyond the new look. A-line, H-line, Y-line, conceptual alphabets that announce fashion as a legible language rather than a seasonal stutter. People mock the romance in his house mythology. They forget that fairy tales are how a civilization instructs itself to hope with technical specificity. But Dior's liturgy invites counter-sermons. After war, after rationing, after women entered factories and offices with competence that required no corseted proof, did the return of volume not risk reinstalling the old altar of spectacle? Here the contradiction is clarifying. The new look both consolidates and destabilizes patriarchy. It consolidates by reinstating a gaze trained to adore delicacy. It destabilizes by converting delicacy into power by sheer concentration of craft. The wearer is not a doll. She is a sovereign whose robe is a constitution. The economy learns this quickly. Couture's ceremony sells perfumes and dreams, and the brand becomes a nation-state exporting its flag. Dior teaches luxury the modern trick. Subsidize the cathedral with coins minted in the apothecary, but keep the mass true or the coins lose their face. In his wake, successors argue with the master by trimming, sharpening, abstracting. Yet the bar jacket persists as a moral, a reminder that optimism can be engineered at the ribcage. Then, Balenciaga, whom others call the couturier's couturier because his knowledge of cut transforms sewing into pure mathematics performed in fabric, and yet mathematics that never forgets the human error it must dignify. He is the sculptor who refuses to apologize for volume, insisting that space around the body is part of the garment's truth, that dignity sometimes requires air. The cocoon coat, the semi-fitted suit, the sack dress that prefigures ease before ease becomes a cliché. These are not negations of femininity, but arguments that the silhouette can refuse flattery and still be profoundly beautiful. He will let a sleeve begin at the neck, not as gimmick but as correction. The arm, he says in cloth, does not begin where tailors have lazily assumed. Watch one of his collars stand away from the throat like a halo that declines superstition. Notice how his hems tilt to reconcile gravity with stride. Observe the silence of his surfaces, where embellishment appears only when it can serve as light, not as noise. Spanishness is not an accent here. It is a theology. Black as argument, lace as disciplined excess. Catholic architecture refracted into seeming that carries vaults and naves into the everyday. Balenciaga's austerity is not cold. It is compassion. Austerity becomes generous when it refuses to bully the body into pleasantries, when it confers privacy as a luxury greater than diamonds. To wear his volume is to be told, politely and without explanation to passers-by, that you are allowed to keep part of yourself to yourself. This is why other couturiers knelt, not to worship difficulty, but to honor that his difficulty delivered ease. He closed his house when ready-to-wear's tempo made the calendar inhospitable to concentration. That act, too, is a contribution, a refusal to counterfeit attention. And the lineage he seeds is technical rather than theatrical. Even designers unlike him in surface inherit his doctrine that seams can be thesis statements, that a pattern is a philosophy, that a toil is not a sketch but a court hearing where the body testifies and the cloth must be persuaded. Set the three together and the century becomes legible as a debate about what women owe to public time. Chanel says, "You owe nothing except competence. Let your clothes make room for your work." Dior says, "You owe the world a visible hope. Let your clothes assemble it visibly, because visibility too is work." Balenciaga says, "You owe yourself protection. Let your clothes negotiate space on your behalf so the world approaches you on terms you choose." Each position has a shadow. Chanel's competence slips into class signaling. Dior's hope risks theatrical dependence on scarcity's memory. Balenciaga's protection can be misread as distance. But shadows clarify edges, and luxury evolves by learning which edge a given moment needs sharpened. When economies contract, Chanel's restraint reads like solidarity. When societies need ritual, Dior's ceremony reads like medicine. When surveillance intensifies, Balenciaga's volume reads like sanctuary. The luxury market translates these doctrines into products downstream: jackets that behave, dresses that argue, coats that negotiate. So the couture sermon reaches believers who never enter the temple. Attend to the hands, because without them, this is only rhetoric. In Chanel's workrooms, quilting is not motif, but memory. The jacket's interior maps a conversation between fabric and movement so direct that the exterior appears inevitable. In Dior's tailleur salons, pad stitching is a climate, the slow accretion of resilience, while the Flou ateliers conduct liquid physics experiments with tulle, organza, and bias to determine how hope should fall. In Balenciaga's house, moulage is not technique but epistemology, the belief that knowledge arrives by draping over truth rather than forcing truth into pre-drawn lines. When we speak of impact on luxury's evolution, we mean precisely this migration of method. Fast fashion can copy a shape in 24 hours. It cannot copy a conscience trained to feel millimeters. The broader market learns indirectly. Fused inner linings approximate Chanel's stability, factory-pressed darts echo Dior's clarity, generous armholes and tilted planes invoke Balenciaga's kindness. These are not counterfeits. They are dialect conversions, proof that couture's ethics leaks, and a leak can irrigate. Let us interrogate ideology plainly, because fashion history becomes banal when it forgets power. Chanel's ascent coincides with women entering public professions in greater numbers. Her clothes read as uniforms for sovereignty at the scale of the desk, the boardroom, the boulevard. That her brand later cultivates an aura of expensive restraint is not betrayal but consequence. To make a uniform for autonomy is to attract those who wish to purchase the appearance of autonomy. Dior's post-war abundance flirts with reactionary nostalgia, yet in practice it paid thousands of hands and rebuilt artisanal networks shattered by war. The politics of plenty can fund the politics of dignity. Balenciaga's refusal of spectacle looks elitist until you stand in one of his coats and feel the permission it grants to exit the economy of flirtation. Each ideology builds a different social choreography, and luxury evolves by staging those dances in department stores, advertisements, and habits. A woman crosses a street differently in a Chanel skirt than in a Dior ball gown. She sits differently in a Balenciaga cocoon. She speaks differently because the garment has pre-negotiated some part of the conversation on her behalf. Consider, too, their temporalities. Chanel designs for the day, for repetition, for the loop of tasks that make a life. Time in her house is cyclic, and the jacket is a metronome. Dior designs for the event, for the punctuation mark in a paragraph of days. Time in his house is episodic, and the silhouette is a stanza break. Balenciaga designs for duration, for the long arc in which memory must be carried without fatigue. Time in his house is architectural, and the garment is a room you can inhabit without explanation. Luxury's evolution across the century is the weaving of these time scales into one wardrobe, first for the elite and then, through diffusion and desire, for anyone who wants their week to contain competence, ceremony, and sanctuary in proportions they choose. This is why the icons cannot be replaced by trend summaries. They encode temporal rights into fabric. If we drop below philosophy to the molecular level of technique, we see how signatures become algorithms. Chanel's cardigan jacket is an equation. Soft shell plus stabilized interior plus calibrated hem weight equals mobility that reads as poise. Dior's bar jacket is another. Sculpted waist plus assertive shoulder plus controlled flare equals optimism embodied without apology. Balenciaga's one-seam sleeve, his stand-away collar, his envelope dress are proofs. Reduce seam count plus move volumes away from stress points, plus tilt planes with respect to gravity equals dignity that does not tire the wearer. When later designers inherit these algorithms, they mutate them without erasing the logic. Lagerfeld compounds Chanel's code with seasonal dialects. Saint Laurent borrows Dior's grammar to compose bolder sentences and then invents an entirely new clause with Le Smoking. Contemporary minimalists attempt Balenciaga's proofs with knit architectures and bonded seams. Luxury evolves by refactoring old theorems into new problems. The psychoanalytic return is unavoidable because these houses do not sell cloth. They sell relations to the self. Chanel proposes an ego disciplined by utility, a self that refuses to be overdetermined by decoration. Her suit says, "I am here to decide." Dior proposes a superego reconciled to pleasure, a self that allows ceremony to justify expenditure. His gown says, "I am here to bless." Balenciaga proposes an ID that has outgrown hunger, a self that no longer begs for attention because it possesses attention's source. His coat says, "I am here to remain." Of course, these are fictions, but fictions engineered with such consistency that they alter behavior. In private, in mirrors, a wearer rehearses these lines until they become muscle memory, and this rehearsal is how fashion does its deepest social work, by changing how we feel the sentence, "I am," while walking down a hallway. One must still return to the ateliers as political economies. Chanel's codification of the house as a matrix of repeatable codes stabilizes employment. Dior's expansion after 1947 reconstitutes crafts as living systems. Balenciaga's severity sanctifies excellence to a degree that scares away investors but tutors generations of cutters. Luxury's later corporate structures, perfume licensing, accessories engines, global retail, adopt these houses as keystones because a brand without a credible couture ancestry is a tent without a pole. This is not nostalgia, it is structural. The bag sells because the jacket once told the truth. The sneaker sells because the coat once protected a person from noise. The lipstick sells because the dress once persuaded a room to believe in celebration again. If contemporary commerce sometimes forgets this, markets remind it whenever a brand drifts into empty spectacle. Sales fall, trust withers, and suddenly the house remembers it must return to the workroom and ask a sleeve to justify itself. The comparative method sharpens our view of impact. Chanel teaches the century how to abbreviate without impoverishing. Dior teaches it how to amplify without lying. Balenciaga teaches it how to abstract without alienating. These verbs, abbreviate, amplify, abstract, migrate into furniture, architecture, graphic design, even software interfaces. A clear UI is a Chanel gesture. A celebratory launch event with ritualized unboxing is a Dior echo. A generous white space around content is a Balenciaga value. Fashion is not a mirror. It is a toolkit. The early couturiers built tools that outlived their contexts, and luxury's evolution is, in part, the spread of those tools into cultures of making far outside the Rue Cambon, Avenue Montaigne, or Avenue George V. If you demand that we address the charge of myth-making head-on, didn't each of these figures rely on teams, on silent hands, on networks of suppliers whose names never appear on labels? The answer is yes, and that is precisely why we must talk about them as institutions rather than individuals. The Chanel that endures is the codebook plus the training program that instructs a young hand how to feel when a sleeve is honest. The Dior that matters is the choreography of tailleur and fleu that teaches a house to balance force with grace. The Balenciaga that terrifies and inspires is the willingness to scrap 10 toils if the 11th has not achieved the right silence. To profile them responsibly is to profile their methods of transmitting tacit knowledge, their ethics of revision, their tolerance for difficulty. Their impact on luxury is multiplied through pedagogy. Assistants become directors elsewhere. Embroiderers found their own ateliers. Clients become collectors who fund museums that then preserve the evidence of what care can do. Return for a moment to the body, because the temptation in a lecture like this is to leave the wearer behind in favor of theory. Chanel's suit feels like breath that has learned posture. Dior's bar suit feels like certainty that has learned to smile. Balenciaga's coat feels like privacy that has learned hospitality. These sensations are not incidental. They are the purpose. When luxury evolves responsibly, it evolves toward making these sensations available more widely through diffusion, collaboration, and influence without degrading the source. The failure mode is when diffusion keeps the sign and discards the sensation. Then luxury becomes costume. The early icons warn against this by the example of their severity. Chanel's relentless editing, Dior's relentless construction, Balenciaga's relentless refusal to flatter cheaply. Severity is kindness in disguise because it spares the wearer from the humiliation of fraud. We could spiral endlessly through anecdotes. Chanel's sailor jerseys in Deauville, the first bar jacket shocking a starved world, Balenciaga cutting in silence while clients whispered. But the point behind the legends is the same. Each house made a pact with reality to tell a particular truth about what clothing can do for a life. The pact is renewable each season only if the truth is re-earned at the level of cut. That is why these names remain gravitational centers while others become footnotes. Their truths were not trends, but disciplines. A discipline can guide a century because it does not exhaust itself in novelty. It refreshes itself by returning to first principles under new conditions. Chanel returns to ease under new anxieties. Dior returns to ceremony under new cynicisms. Balenciaga returns to volume under new exposures. Together, they form a triangulation device for anyone trying to navigate luxury's shifting terrains. If you know where ease, ceremony, and volume sit relative to one another in a given moment, you can plot a course that feels both of the moment and exacting. And so the lecture continues, not toward closure, but toward deeper recursion, because to understand the impact of Chanel, Dior, and Balenciaga is to accept that every decade afterward is a commentary on their arguments. When minimalism surges, Chanel's doctrine is quoted. When maximalism returns, Dior's hymn is remixed. When conceptual fashion seeks shelter from spectacle, Balenciaga's geometry is consulted. The evolution of luxury fashion is not a queue of replacements, but a parliament of returning voices. And these three voices, distinct, dissonant, oddly harmonious, keep the debate honest. If we keep listening, the debate teaches us less about clothes than about care. That care can be brisk, can be celebratory, can be spacious. That care can be measured in stitches, but also in the way a person takes a seat and discovers that, for once, the world has already made room. The golden age of couture is misnamed if we mistake gold for glitter, for what shone in the 1950s was not merely sequins under salon light, but the slow, weighty radiance of systems perfected under pressure, workrooms reconstituted after rupture, rituals reconstructed after rationing, bodies redrafted into futures they were told might never arrive. And the term post-war does not simply timestamp an era, but announces a philosophical wager that scarcity would no longer dictate silhouettes, that attention could be squandered again as a form of faith, that cloth itself could be coaxed to believe in abundance. The century had burned, the houses reopened their windows, the city breathed, and couture, newly formalized by the law and newly solemnized by memory, unfurled a liturgy of glamour that was neither frivolous nor naive. It was a politics of optimism executed at the level of seam. Begin, of course, with Dior's act of reparation disguised as provocation. The new look, which the shorthand reduces to nipped waists and acreage in skirts, but which in its anatomy is a grammar, shoulders that decline militarism without collapsing, a bosom acknowledged without vulgarity, a waist sculpted not to imprison but to articulate, hips granted ceremony so that walking becomes a public sentence of grace. And beneath the visible theater lives an infrastructure of hidden tapes, corselets, inner linings, wadding that do not coerce the body so much as accompany it, like a well-architected sentence that carries the mind where it already wanted to go, but did not yet know the path. When the skirts swished across Avenue Montaigne in 1947 and through the 1950s, they did not announce reactionary nostalgia. They announced the return of time to cut, to baste, to fit again and again until the garment felt inevitable. Time to invest days of embroidery into a square decimeter because tomorrow existed and would reward patience. Time to restore the handshake between tailleur and flou, so structure and liquidity could again debate without shouting. That is why the new look is not reducible to a diagram. It is reducible only to a discipline. Hope executed meticulously until hope looks like form. Yet it is precisely when we canonize Dior that we must complicate him with his contemporaries and his context, because the golden age is a chorus, not a solo. Balenciaga stands nearby like a cathedral that refuses to advertise itself, proposing volumes that contradict the logic of flattery in order to install the logic of dignity, cocooning backs and softening shoulders so that ease can read as authority. His semi-fitted suits and envelope dresses argue that privacy is a luxury greater than sparkle, that the most radical gesture after spectacle is silence cut perfectly. Chanel returns in 1954 with what looks like restraint and is in fact defiance, a diagnosis that women need a uniform for sovereignty more than a costume for display, A cardigan jacket whose inner quilting is memory-made material. A chain at the hem that tutors the line to hang with low-voiced confidence. A skirt that collaborates with walking rather than choreographing it. Her suit is less a silhouette than a schedule, designed for the long day and the long life of a garment that will be altered and inherited. Balmain articulates a courtly glamour precise enough to withstand the flashbulb. Foth sketches movement as persuasion. Givenchy, young and severe in his elegance, offers separates that turn rigor into air and collaborates with a new kind of global icon, not bred in palaces but produced by cameras, Audrey Hepburn, whose presence helps proof a thesis that couture will henceforth disseminate itself not only through salon whispers but through images exported at the speed of magazines and movies. To call this a golden age is also to note that gold was minted as law. The post-1945 formalization of haute couture within the French federative system gave the term juridical contour, requiring Paris ateliers, minimum numbers of staff, twice-yearly presentations, and made-to-measure production through fittings. And while cynics hear bureaucracy, the ateliers heard scaffolding. The rules prevented the word haute from dissolving into marketing fog, and by protecting the meaning, they protected the economy of craft. Embroidery houses like Lesage, featherworkers like Lemarrier, pleaters like Lognan, milliners with names known and unknown, whose survival required orders at a scale small enough to be private and large enough to stay alive. Regulation in this sense is not a cage, but a ladder. By climbing it, houses performed competence, and competence bred trust, and trust could be licensed across oceans without the code disintegrating into kitsch. Miss Dior, the perfume-financed hothouse couture without degrading it. Patterns were licensed to American manufacturers under Christian Dior New York so that the halo could pay the choir. Vogue patterns and department store adaptations translated the thesis for households far from Paris. And if translation is betrayal, it is also how ideas travel. And this is how the new look became not merely a look, but a lingua franca. The era's emphasis on glamour and femininity, then, should be read not as ideological regression, but as a negotiation with history's wound. After uniforms, the feminine silhouette functioned as counter-uniform, not to demote women to decoration, but to relocate power in rituals women could own. The cocktail dress, the day suit, the dinner ensemble, the ball gown. These categories are often derided as etiquette's cages, but in the 1950s they provided coded spaces where women could calibrate how much to show, how much to shield, how much to celebrate. And the couture house behaved as a kind of secular confessor, taking measurements not only of hips and bust, but of appetite and sense of risk. Dior's bar jacket announces that a waist can be a fulcrum without becoming a fetish. Balenciaga's collar that stands away from the throat grants breath literal dignity. Chanel's tweed rejects the tyranny of sheen with the insistence that tactile knowledge, how a sleeve feels at R9, is superior to optical seduction. Glamour in this register is not glitter. It is the power of being seen on terms you chose in a room that did not expect you to choose. Global influence is sometimes plotted as a map of stores and licenses. Beneath that cartography runs a deeper river of method. Photographers Irving Penn and Richard Avedon translate movement and stillness into archetypes that teach the world how a skirt should turn in space and how a jacket should hold its axis. Editors from Carmel Snow to Diana Vreeland shape a transatlantic ear for line so the audience can hear cut in a photograph. Hollywood consumes couture and returns it amplified, dressing stars not as mannequins but as ambassadors. Hepburn's Givenchy, Grace Kelly's love affair with Parisian finish, Marlene Dietrich's severe glamour that could wear strict tailoring as seduction. And the image economy reaches women who will never enter a salon yet, will absorb the lesson that fit is not snobbery but a form of respect. British couture develops its own court, Hardy Amy's, Norman Hartnell, offering monarchy's ritual in crystalline English. Italian alta moda dresses, La Dolce Vita through Fontana Sisters, and Schubert before a Roman newcomer named Valentino learns how red can become a signature. American sportswear watches and steals responsibly, converting couture's insistence on proportion into separates that can work a weekday. What travels is less silhouette than seriousness, a sense that a garment owes the wearer coherence. Inside the rooms, the golden age is also a golden discipline. Premiers who rule tables like quiet sovereigns, fit models whose bodies become instruments that teach bias and grain a language. Petites mains who execute embroidery, not for display alone, but to manipulate weight and light, so the gaze reads intention correctly. Cutters who draft not merely shapes, but arguments about how the body should occupy a chair or descend a stair. The schedule is relentless but ceremonial. Collections rather than drops, seasons as movements in a symphony that continues from January to July to January again, and every show is a mass in which the bride appears as a finale, not to sentimentalize marriage, but to present belief. The house believes that fabric can still carry meaning across the distance between body and eye. Guests who can afford to order, and guests who can only afford to dream, both receive instruction in the grammar of care. Both leave with memories that will shape wardrobes and desires for years. If glamour looks easy, it is because difficulty has been disciplined into silence. Still, we must interrogate the ideology without flinching. A silhouette that magnifies the skirt risks coding femininity as surface. A waist that insists on itself risks coding discipline as desire. A salon that filters clients by wealth risks confusing attention with hierarchy. And yet, attention in the 50s is radical precisely because mass production is scaling indifference. The couture house, by insisting on multiple fittings, insists that a person is not a size. By preserving craft lineages, it insists that knowledge passed from hand to hand is not a quaint hobby, but a modern technology. By embracing images, it insists that aesthetics is a public language, not a private vice. The contradiction is not solvable, it is livable, and couture lives it by teaching downstream markets to care slightly more. Better interlinings, truer shoulder lines, hems that fall like sentences that know when to stop. If democracy learns to expect that quality should be visible and tangible, the Golden Age has democratized without descending. The 1950s are also a hinge in talent succession and the ethics of legacy. Dior, who arrives like a comet, leaves the sky in 1957, and the house names as his successor and assistant, a boy of 21, Yves Saint Laurent, whose 1958 trapeze collection gently releases the waist without insulting the bar jacket's memory, proving that reverence can be inventive. Balenciaga will continue to edit silence until silence becomes the loudest truth in the room. Chanel's second act will outlive her, because it is not dependent on personality, but on a code book that can be taught. Givenchy's alliance with Hepburn invents a feedback loop between cinema and couture that defines aspiration for a world that will soon be able to fly. The Golden Age's glamour is therefore not only a surface, but a school. It institutionalizes the atelier as a site where pedagogies of touch are preserved, where apprenticeships have stakes, where patience is not a luxury but a curriculum. If we zoom into materials, the decade becomes a laboratory in which fabric does not merely dress the body, but disciplines physics. Silk organza learns to carry light as if carrying air. Taffeta remembers sound so that movement composes its own soundtrack. Tulle ceases to be cloud and becomes architecture when layered with cunning. Wool tweed, under Chanel's hand, learns civility without stiffness. Satin regains its authority by being asked to behave rather than to brag. Embroidery, too, evolves from pictorial to optical, used not only to draw motifs, but to shift weight and reflect luminance so that the eye travels where the house wants it to go. Feathers are not plumes, but calibrations of edge. Beading is not brightness, but tempo. Footwear, under Roger Vivier's collaboration with Dior, articulates the stiletto as a line that is more equation than spike, load distribution making audacity safe, and millinery experiments with veils as variable opacity, teaching even the face to speak in layers. The result is that glamour becomes engineering you can feel. Global influence has another vector, the licensing of ideas without the loss of dignity. American department stores commission Paris models to be made domestically under arrangement, and while purists complain, the practice ensures that the couture philosophy infiltrates middle-class wardrobes through pattern, proportion, and finish. Women buy Vogue patterns and cut at home not simply to imitate but to learn, and this pedagogical diffusion matters as much as ambassadorial gowns. Magazines serialize the collections, and the image of a woman in a new-look coat crossing a street in New York or Buenos Aires or Tokyo becomes a mobile lesson in how fabric can converse with architecture. Fashion weeks elsewhere begin to coalesce, not as rivals, but as dialects. The Golden Age of Paris is therefore also an age of translation, and translation is how civilizations converse with themselves. We must also ask why femininity was emphasized and who was allowed to narrate it. The 50s propose a woman whose public role remains negotiated and whose private aspirations are expanding. Couture gives her tools to navigate that contradiction. A cinched waist can be an imposition or a declaration. A full skirt can be spectacle or shield. A collar that stands away can invite or warn. The same garment on different wearers speaks differently, and Couture's genius is to recognize that biography must be sewn into cut-through fittings, that two women ordering the same suit will receive not the same but the similar, because similarity is the language of respect when identities diverge. Feminine glamour here is not the reduction of woman to ornament. It is the construction of a vocabulary by which woman can instruct a room in how she wishes to be read. The fact that this vocabulary was invented by houses led mostly by men, with the singular exception of Chanel, is not lost on us. It complicates the ethics without invalidating the efficacy, and later decades will rewrite authorship more equitably while retaining the grammar the 50s perfected. Economically, the Golden Age clarifies that couture is not a profit center, but a cultural reactor. It stabilizes crafts, sets standards, and emanates narratives that sell other goods. But more abstractly, it holds a brand's metaphysical credit. A handbag can pass through 10 owners. A perfume can diffuse through millions of rooms. Both remain dignified so long as the house continues to prove, twice annually, that it remembers how to pay attention in a way machines cannot. That proof is taken in by buyers who will never order a couture piece. They still recognize the ring of truth when a jacket sits right at the shoulder. If later decades appear to move the center of gravity from salon to storefront, it is partly because the Golden Age set in motion the centrifugal force by which attention could circulate without evaporating, and that circulation is the triumph, care scaled, not by multiplying couture, but by disseminating its ethics. There is a temptation to call the 50s tidy, to file them under pretty, to let nostalgia write the lecture. Resist it. The decade is haunted by memory and animated by invention. Its prettiness is an armor and its tidiness hard-won. The ateliers are full of people who remember hunger, who learned during occupation and blackout to make do, who now insist that making splendidly is not waste but recompense, and every gleam is a refusal to let brutality be the last aesthetic. If a gown looks like a chandelier, it is because someone decided that light should belong to bodies again. If a suit reads like certainty, it is because someone decided that shoulders should no longer carry only grief. The Golden Age is therefore ethical work disguised as elegance. It attempts to teach a wounded world the muscle memory of pleasure. What, finally, did the 1950s do to global fashion? They authored a common expectation that clothing can be legible, that silhouette can argue with architecture rather than surrender to it, that a city is a stage where citizenship is performed partly through dress, and that craftsmanship is not antiquarian but futurist because it imagines a future wearer and makes promises to her. They built an arch between boutique and boulevard, film and fitting room, atelier table and living room sewing machine, and across that arch travels not only form, but responsibility. When later decades tear at the arch, youthquake's iconoclasm, minimalism's severity, maximalism's satire, the structure holds because the stones were set with insistence. Fit is respect, proportion is power, finish is honesty, and attention is love. So let the Golden Age be golden for the right reasons, not because it sparkled, though it did, but because it disciplined desire into forms sturdy enough to bear the weight of history. Dior's optimism engineered at the ribcage, Chanel's sovereignty calibrated at the shoulder, Balenciaga's sanctuary carved out of air, Balmain's polished diplomacy, Foth's kinetic persuasion, Givenchy's poised breath, embroiderer's constellations, pleater's topographies, featherworker's quiet thunder, photographer's alchemy, editor's grammar, client's biographies, all conspiring to write a decade-long argument that glamour could be serious and seriousness could be beautiful. And if we still look back and call it a golden age, it is because when we touch a jacket that sits right, or watch a skirt that knows how to turn, or smell a perfume that makes a room remember elegance without intimidation, we are touching the residue of promises kept, the ongoing proof that care, once taught, does not easily forget how to speak. We begin not with a history, but with an autopsy of a system, of an idea, of a certain kind of world that believed itself to be eternal. The subject of our examination is haute couture, in the crucible of the 1960s and 1970s, An era that did not so much reform this gilded institution as subject it to a profound existential schism from which it would never truly recover in its original form. To speak of haute couture in the post-war period, in the golden age of Dior's new look and the subsequent reign of Balenciaga and Givenchy, is to speak of a fortress. It was a hermetically sealed universe, an edifice of almost sacred exclusivity, built upon the twin pillars of unimaginable craft and unassailable wealth. This was a world governed by ritual, the hushed salons, the numbered presentation cards, the dictatorial pronouncements of the couturier, the meticulous near-invisible stitches of the petite's mains, and the intensely personal, almost feudal relationship between the designer and his client. The client, a woman of a certain age, of a specific social stratum, did not simply buy a dress. She commissioned an object, an armor of social standing, a testament to her husband's or her father's power. The garment was secondary to the performance of its acquisition. It was a system predicated on stability, on a social order that seemed as fixed and as permanent as the whalebone in a corselet. This system did not merely sell clothes. It sold an ideology of femininity, a mature, controlled, and deeply conservative vision of womanhood, sculpted and constrained by the very architecture of the garments themselves. It was, in its essence, anti-modern, a relic of aristocratic patronage masquerading in the language of mid-century elegance. But what happens when the world outside the fortress gates begins to beat with a different rhythm? What happens when history accelerates, when the very foundations of that stable social order begin to tremble and crack? The 1960s did not politely knock on the door of haute couture. It hurled a grenade through the salon window. This grenade was the youthquake, a demographic and cultural explosion that fundamentally reconfigured the landscape of desire, identity, and consumption. Suddenly, the ideal consumer was not the 50-year-old society matron, but her 19-year-old daughter. And this daughter wanted none of her mother's world. She wanted to move, to dance, to protest, to exist in a body that was free, unconstrained, and radically present. Her soundtrack was not the polite salon orchestra, but the raw, amplified energy of rock and roll. Her Bible was not Vogue magazine's society pages, but the vibrant, anarchic street styles percolating in London's Carnaby Street and the King's Road. This was a somatic rebellion, a revolution of the body itself. The stiff, constructed silhouette of couture, designed for a life of chauffeurs and formal dinners, was not just unfashionable. It was ideologically offensive to a generation that prized spontaneity, authenticity, and mobility. The miniskirt, that ultimate symbol of the era, was not merely a matter of a raised hemline. It was a political statement, a declaration of bodily autonomy and a rejection of the patriarchal gaze that had for so long dictated the terms of female presentation. Couture, with its painstaking fittings and its astronomical price tags, was simply not equipped to speak this new language. It was too slow, too expensive, too formal, too old. Into this ideological breach stepped two figures who were, paradoxically, insiders of the couture system: André Courrèges and Pierre Cardin. They were not street-level rebels. They were trained couturiers who understood the craft and the system from the inside out. Yet, they acted as visionary agents of rupture, attempting to hijack the vehicle of couture and steer it into the future. André Courrèges, in particular, mounted what can only be described as a utopian aesthetic assault. His collections of the mid-1960s were not so much clothes as they were architectural propositions for a new kind of woman living in a new kind of world. His was the space age, a clean, clinical, and profoundly optimistic vision rendered in a palette of lunar white, silver, and stark primary colors. He liberated the body from the waist, dropping the silhouette into a crisp A-line shape that skimmed the torso and ended in a shockingly high hemline. He introduced the go-go boot, a flat, calf-high piece of footwear that was the very antithesis of the delicate stiletto, designed for striding, for action, for marching into a technologically advanced tomorrow. His materials were often industrial and synthetic: plastics, PVC, bonded jersey, materials that broke decisively with couture's slavish devotion to silk, satin, and wool. Courrèges was not dressing the society wife. He was dressing the female astronaut, the modern urbanite, the citizen of a future society free from the sentimental baggage of the past. It was a radical, almost totalitarian vision of purity and function, a kind of sartorial Le Corbusier. Yet, in its very perfection, its very couturier-level execution, it revealed a central contradiction. It was a revolution from above, a top-down decree of freedom that was still, at its core, a product of the exclusive, prohibitively expensive couture system. It was a future that only a very few could afford to inhabit. Pierre Cardin, on the other hand, represented a different vector of futuristic thinking, one that was perhaps more prescient and, ultimately, more corrosive to the old couture system. While Courrèges was the ascetic architect, Cardin was the cosmic fantasist and the consummate capitalist visionary. His designs were less about functional purity and more about a kind of pop art science fiction. He gave us the Cosmos collection, with its hard-shelled tunics, porthole cutouts, and sculptural helmets. His silhouettes were geometric, abstract, often unisex, treating the body less as a form to be flattered and more as an armature for his kinetic sculptures. He used vinyl, molded plastics, and large-scale hardware with an almost fetishistic glee. But Cardin's true revolution was not merely aesthetic. It was economic. He understood, with a clarity that eluded many of his contemporaries, that the future of fashion did not lie in the cloistered salons of Paris, but in the global marketplace. He was a pioneer of pret-à-porter, or ready-to-wear, recognizing that the mass production of a designer's vision was not a vulgar dilution of a pure idea, but the very engine of modern cultural and economic power. More than that, he grasped the profound power of the brand itself. He began licensing his name with an almost manic promiscuity, putting it on everything from menswear to furniture, from perfumes to frying pans. The old guard of couture was aghast. To them, this was a betrayal of the sacred trust, a profanation of the couturier's art. But Cardin saw the truth. The name, the logo, the signature was a more durable and profitable commodity than any single, hand-stitched garment could ever be. He was engineering the blueprint for the modern fashion empire, a vertically integrated system where the haute couture collection serves not as the primary business, but as a spectacular, loss-leading marketing event designed to sell the accessible products, the lipstick, the sunglasses, the handbag, to a global mass audience. In doing so, he wasn't just adapting couture, he was effectively signing its death warrant as an economically central system. This dialectic between the street and the salon, between the bottom-up revolution of the youthquake and the top-down modernism of Cardin and Courrèges, created a profound crisis of identity for the entire institution of haute couture. The system was predicated on its authority, on its divine right to dictate taste. But suddenly, the most vital, the most energetic, the most culturally significant fashion was happening elsewhere, on the streets, in music videos, in independent boutiques. Couture was no longer the sole originator of style. It was becoming, in many instances, a follower. And this is where the figure of Yves Saint Laurent becomes so pivotal, so central to our autopsy. Saint Laurent was, in every sense, the dauphin of the old system. He was the hand-picked successor to Christian Dior, the boy wonder who had inherited the most powerful throne in fashion. Yet his genius lay in his unparalleled ability to act as a bridge, a translator between the rarefied world of the salon and the vibrant, often messy reality of the contemporary world. He did not reject the street. He absorbed it, elevated it, and represented it through the prism of his exquisite sensibility and the unparalleled craft of his couture atelier. In 1966, he launched his Rive Gauche line, the first freestanding ready-to-wear boutique opened by a couturier. This was a seismic event. It was not a secondary diffusion line. It was a laboratory for Saint Laurent's most immediate and revolutionary ideas. It was through Rive Gauche that he democratized his own vision, making it accessible to the very young women who were inspiring him. He looked at the street and saw not vulgarity, but vitality. He saw the pea coat of the sailor, the safari jacket of the adventurer, the trench coat of the soldier, and he transformed these utilitarian garments into objects of high fashion. He looked at the growing movement for female liberation and created Le Smoking, the tuxedo for women, a garment of such radical and enduring power that it fundamentally rewrote the codes of evening wear, and, by extension, the codes of gender itself. It was an act of sartorial and political transfiguration, endowing women with the symbolic power of menswear, while simultaneously creating something devastatingly seductive and feminine. Saint Laurent's work in this period was a masterclass in adaptation. He demonstrated that couture could survive not by remaining aloof and isolated in its ivory tower, but by engaging in a dynamic, ongoing conversation with the culture at large. He saved couture, perhaps, by proving that its techniques and its intelligence could be applied to a modern reality. But in doing so, he also implicitly confirmed that its future lay not in its exclusivity, but in its translation into the more democratic and commercially viable format of ready-to-wear. The economic pressures underpinning this cultural crisis cannot be overstated. By the late 1960s, the very business model of haute couture was becoming untenable. The client base was, quite literally, dying out. The new generation of wealthy individuals, the pop stars and the new money entrepreneurs, were less inclined to submit to the rigid formalities and extensive fittings of the couture process. Simultaneously, the costs of production were skyrocketing. A single couture garment could require hundreds of hours of labor from a team of highly skilled artisans, the petites mains, whose salaries and skills were becoming increasingly expensive to maintain. The price of a couture dress, already astronomical, rose to a point where even the very rich began to balk. The system was buckling under its own weight. It was a pre-industrial craft model trying to survive in a post-industrial mass-market world. The numbers simply no longer added up. This economic reality forced a brutal reckoning. Couturiers were faced with a stark choice: adapt or die. Many, tragically, chose the latter. The most significant closure was that of Cristobal Balenciaga in 1968. Balenciaga was, by near unanimous consent, the greatest couturier of his generation, a master of form, cut, and construction whose genius was revered by his peers, including Dior himself. He was the ultimate purist, an artist who refused to compromise his vision. When he saw the direction the world was heading, towards a casual, youth-driven, ready-to-wear market, he did not attempt to adapt. He simply stopped. He famously declared that the life of a couturier is a dog's life, and shuttered his house, believing that the world in which his art could exist and be appreciated was gone forever. His closure was a symbolic death knell. If the master, the couturier's couturier, could no longer see a future for the craft, then what hope was there for anyone else? His departure left a vacuum and sent a shockwave of existential dread through the remaining houses. It was a clear signal that the old ways were not just outdated, they were obsolete. The 1970s, therefore, began not with a bang, but with a prolonged, often confusing period of fragmentation and redefinition. The singular monolithic authority of Paris as the sole arbiter of fashion was irrevocably broken. London had its anarchic punk scene, America had the polished sportswear of Halston and the wrap dress pragmatism of Diane von Furstenberg, and Italy was beginning to emerge as a powerhouse of luxury ready-to-wear. Couture, for its part, seemed to drift, searching for a new raison d'etre. What was its purpose in a world dominated by lifestyle branding and mass trends? Some houses clung to a nostalgic recreation of past glories, serving a dwindling list of aging clients and Middle Eastern royalty. Others, following the Saint Laurent model, used the couture show primarily as a spectacular marketing platform, a laboratory of ideas that would be diluted and commercialized for their far more profitable ready-to-wear and accessories lines. The couture collection became a form of propaganda for the brand, a theatrical performance designed to generate press and reinforce an image of ultimate luxury, an image that could then be used to sell perfume, scarves, and licensed goods. This was the triumph of the Cardin model. The garment itself became less important than the aura it projected. We see, in this period, a bifurcation of fashion's soul. On one hand, the unstoppable rise of democratic, industrial, and brand-driven ready-to-wear. On the other, the retreat of haute couture into an increasingly rarefied and symbolic realm. It ceased to be the engine of fashion and became instead its conscience, its archive, its living museum. It was a repository of craft and technique, a space where time, cost, and commercial viability could be momentarily suspended in the name of pure creation. But this also meant it had lost its direct cultural urgency. It was no longer a reflection of how people lived, but a fantasy of how a very, very small number of people could dream of living. This transition from a system of production to a system of communication marks a profound philosophical shift in the nature of the fashion object itself. We can interrogate this through the lens of thinkers like Walter Benjamin. The haute couture garment of the 1950s was an object with an aura. It was a unique work of art, created in a specific time and place for a specific body, bearing the physical trace of its creator and the hands of the artisans who made it. Its value was intrinsic to its singularity, its unreproducible presence. The rise of ready-to-wear, amplified by the explosion of mass media in the 1960s, is analogous to what Benjamin described as the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. The fashion idea, the Mondrian dress by Saint Laurent, for example, was now infinitely reproducible. Its power lay not in the single couture version that existed in the salon, but in the thousands of copies and interpretations that appeared in magazines, on television, and in department stores around the world. The power shifted from the object to the image. The fashion photograph, the magazine spread, became more culturally potent than the garment itself. This semiotic shift is crucial. Couture was a language of substance, of fabric, cut, and construction. The new fashion system was a language of signs, of logos, of images circulating in a global media ecosystem. The body itself was being redefined in this process. The couture body was a sculpted, disciplined physical presence. The 60s media body was a flat, graphic, kinetic image. Think of Twiggy, a being who seemed almost two-dimensional, a collection of lines and shapes perfectly suited for reproduction on the printed page. This dematerialization of the fashion object was something the old couture garde could not, or would not, understand. Theirs was a world of tangible, material luxury. They were being confronted with a world of intangible, image-based desire, a world where the dream of owning the dress was more important than the dress itself. Let us dig deeper into the psychic and political dimensions of this schism. The couture of the old regime was an instrument of social control, a technology for producing a specific kind of bourgeois femininity. Its internal architecture, the boning, the corsetry, the sheer weight of the fabric, disciplined the body, restricting its movement and enforcing a code of ladylike behavior. It was a Foucauldian nightmare in silk taffeta. The youthquake's fashion, in contrast, was a tool of liberation. The unlined, unstructured mini dress, the freedom of trousers, the comfort of knitwear, these were garments that enabled action, that facilitated a new kind of physical and social freedom. The clash between couture and youth culture was not merely a clash of aesthetics. It was a clash of biopolitics. It was a struggle over the very definition of the female body and its place in the social and political sphere. The space-age designs of Courrèges and Cardin can be read as a third way, a kind of technocratic, utopian biopolitics. Their vision was also one of liberation, but it was a liberation through discipline, through a rationalization of the body. The Courrèges woman, in her stark white tunic and flat boots, is an efficient, functional, almost androgynous being. The messy biological realities of the body are erased beneath a clean geometric shell. It is a vision of a post-human femininity, a body perfected and streamlined by design and technology. This represents a very different kind of freedom from the Dionysian, anarchic freedom of the street. It is an Apollonian, controlled freedom, a fantasy of escaping not just the constraints of old-fashioned couture, but the constraints of the flesh itself. Thus, the 1960s fashion landscape becomes a triangular battleground: the conservative, disciplinary body of traditional couture, the rebellious, liberated, politicized body of the youthquake, and the utopian, cybernetic, post-human body of the space-age modernists. The decline of couture in this era can also be read as a crisis of narrative. For decades, couture had provided the master narrative of fashion. Its seasonal pronouncements were handed down from on high and disseminated to the masses. The couturier was the author, the genius, the singular source of meaning. The 1960s and 70s saw the explosion of multiple competing narratives. There was no longer one story, but a polyphony of voices. The street-style photographer, the boutique owner, the pop musician, the political activist, all became authors of fashion meaning. This decentralization of authority was profoundly unsettling for an institution built on a hierarchical, top-down model. Consider the scandal of Saint Laurent's 1971 Libération collection. Inspired by the fashion of the 1940s and the Nazi occupation of Paris, it featured padded shoulders, short skirts, and platform shoes. The collection was almost universally condemned by the press at the time as being in horrific taste, an offensive trivialization of a traumatic historical period. But what Saint Laurent was doing was something radically new for couture. He was engaging with history, with memory, and with the politics of nostalgia. He was using fashion as a form of cultural commentary, as a way of interrogating the past. The collection was a commercial failure and a critical disaster, but in retrospect, it was a landmark. It demonstrated that fashion could be a site of provocation, of intellectual inquiry, of historical consciousness. It was a move away from the timeless, placeless elegance that had been couture's stock in trade and towards a fashion that was embedded in the messiness and complexity of the contemporary world. He was forcing couture to have a point of view, to be about something more than just being beautiful. This was a crucial step in its evolution from a service industry for the rich into a platform for artistic and cultural expression, a role it would more fully embrace in the decades to come under designers like Jean-Paul Gaultier and John Galliano. Let us reconsider the role of the petites mains, those anonymous, highly skilled artisans who were the literal hands of haute couture. The crisis of couture was also their crisis. They were the keepers of a centuries-old tradition of craft, of knowledge passed down through generations. Their skills, in embroidery, in featherwork, in the impossibly complex art of draping and cutting, were the very substance of couture's claim to superiority. The shift towards ready-to-wear, with its emphasis on industrial production and standardized sizing, rendered these skills increasingly irrelevant from a commercial standpoint. The mechanization of fashion threatened to create a world where their artistry was no longer valued or needed. The survival of couture, therefore, became an act of cultural preservation, a conscious effort to keep this repository of human skill from disappearing entirely. The Chambre syndicale de la haute couture, the governing body of the industry, tightened its rules and requirements, turning the designation of haute couture into a legally protected appellation, like champagne or Roquefort cheese. This was a defensive maneuver, an attempt to codify and protect the very things that made couture unique: the made-to-measure process, the use of a private atelier, the presentation of a full collection twice a year. In doing so, it transformed couture from a commercial enterprise into a protected cultural heritage. It became a living museum, subsidized, often indirectly, by the profits from the mass-market goods that bore the designer's name. This is the central paradox of modern haute couture, a paradox that was forged in the crucible of the 1960s and 70s. It must exist as a symbol of pure, uncompromised creativity, a space free from commercial constraint, in order to perform the essential commercial function of selling perfume and handbags to the global middle class. Its symbolic value is inversely proportional to its direct economic viability. It must appear to be above commerce in order to be commercially effective. The 1970s further complicated this picture with the rise of a new kind of anti-fashion ethos. The emergence of punk in the latter half of the decade represented a complete and total rejection of the fashion system itself. Punk fashion was not about aspiring to a designer's vision. It was about deconstruction, about DIY, do-it-yourself aesthetics, about using clothes as a vehicle for raw, aggressive political expression. The ripped t-shirt, the safety pin, the leather jacket covered in studs and slogans, these were not items to be consumed, but statements to be made. This was a fashion of pure negation, an aesthetic of nihilism that spat in the face of both the bourgeois elegance of couture and the optimistic consumerism of ready-to-wear. Against this backdrop, couture could not help but look increasingly decadent, out of touch, and politically irrelevant. It was a beautiful, elaborate fiction in an age that was increasingly demanding harsh, unvarnished truths. The opulence and fantasy of a couture show seemed absurd when the headlines were filled with economic recession, oil crises, and social unrest. This growing chasm between the world of haute couture and the world at large solidified its new role. It was no longer a participant in the mainstream cultural conversation. It was a specialized, niche art form, appreciated by a small circle of connoisseurs, patrons, and collectors. Like opera or ballet, it required a certain initiation, a certain knowledge of its codes and its history, to be fully appreciated. It had completed its journey from the center of the culture to its most luxurious and rarefied periphery. Its survival was secured, but its dominance was a distant memory. The fortress had not been conquered, but it had been surrounded, isolated, and ultimately redefined by the relentless, chaotic, and vibrant new world that had grown up around it. And in that redefinition, we see the blueprint for the complex, contradictory, and endlessly fascinating role that haute couture continues to play in the cultural imagination today. It is a ghost and a machine, a memory of the past and an engine of the future, a sacred art and a profane business, a beautiful lie that tells a fundamental truth about our relationship with clothes, with our bodies, and with the very idea of modernity itself. We begin then, not with a beginning, but with a resuscitation, a violent and glorious reanimation of a corpse that was, by all accounts, already meant to be interred. The corpse, of course, is haute couture. By the late 1970s, the diagnosis was terminal. The pronouncements had been made by the very high priests of the culture that once sustained it. Pierre Cardin, a couturier himself, had declared it a relic, turning his attention to the democratic and infinitely more profitable machinery of ready-to-wear and licensing. The world had changed. The quiet, cloistered rituals of the fitting room, the hushed reverence for the thousand-hour garment, seemed not just obsolete but offensively decadent in an age of social upheaval, oil crises, and a burgeoning youth culture that saw fashion not as an heirloom but as a disposable, semiotic weapon. Couture, with its painstaking hand-sewing, its astronomical price tags, and its minuscule client base of aging heiresses, was a ghost haunting the gilded halls of Avenue Montaigne, a beautiful, anachronistic specter in a world that had ceased to believe in it. And yet, this ghost would not only learn to walk again, it would learn to scream. The 1980s did not simply revive couture. They defibrillated it with pure, unadulterated voltage, transforming it from a private whisper into a public spectacle of such magnificent, aggressive, and ideologically charged force that it would redefine the very logic of luxury for the remainder of the century and beyond. This was not a revival. It was a resurrection fueled by a new kind of capital, a new kind of woman, and a new kind of global media apparatus that was hungry for images of excess. At the epicenter of this explosion stands one name, a name that became synonymous with the exuberant, almost hysterical optimism of the 1980s, Christian Lacroix. When Lacroix opened his own couture house in 1987, with backing from the luxury behemoth LVMH, it was more than a business venture. It was a cultural declaration of war. A war on minimalism, a war on practicality, a war on the dreary, intellectualized anti-fashion of the preceding decade. Lacroix's couture was a defiant celebration of everything that had been deemed irrelevant: history, ornamentation, color, and volume. His most iconic creation, the pouf skirt, that buoyant, almost cartoonish bubble of fabric, was not merely a dress. It was a manifesto. It was a rejection of the sleek, androgynous lines that had dominated the 70s. It was an embrace of a theatrical, exaggerated femininity that drew its inspiration not from the street, but from the archives of history, from the Belle Époque, from the court of Versailles, from the bullfighters of his native Arles. His collections were a delirious collage of references, a riot of taffeta, velvet, and brocade in clashing, vibrant hues of fuchsia, saffron, and turquoise. This was not fashion as utility. It was fashion as pure, unadulterated joy, a form of sartorial hedonism that perfectly mirrored the greed is good ethos of the era. The Lacroix woman was not slipping quietly into a limousine. She was making an entrance, a grand theatrical arrival that announced her wealth, her confidence, and her utter disregard for understatement. The success of Lacroix was a signal that the very function of couture had shifted. It was no longer about dressing a few dozen women in private. It was about creating a dream, a fantasy so potent and so photogenic that it could be disseminated globally, serving as the glittering apex of a brand pyramid, fueling the sales of perfume, scarves, and accessories to a mass audience who could never afford the gown but desperately wanted to buy into the fantasy. This shift cannot be understood outside the context of what we call power dressing. While the Lacroix pouf might seem a world away from the severe, shoulder-padded suits marching through the corporate corridors of New York and London, they are, in fact, two sides of the same ideological coin. Both were sartorial strategies for navigating the new economic landscape of Reaganomics and Thatcherism. The power suit, with its aggressive shoulders and sharp masculine tailoring, was a form of armor for the new professional woman, a way of visually claiming space and authority in a male-dominated world. It was a uniform for the boardroom warrior. But what happened when that warrior left the office? The opulence of 80s couture offered a different kind of power, the power of spectacle, the power of conspicuous consumption. If the daytime uniform was about assimilating into a masculine power structure, the evening fantasy was about transcending it through sheer, unadulterated femininity and wealth. The couture client of the 1980s was not the discreet old-money aristocrat of the 1950s. She was the wife of a corporate raider, a real estate tycoon, a new money magnate. She was, in the Veblennian sense, a walking advertisement for her husband's success. Her dress was not just a dress. It was a financial statement, a visible manifestation of the booming stock market. And so, the designers of the era, Lacroix, but also the revitalized houses of Chanel under Karl Lagerfeld and Yves Saint Laurent in his more opulent moments, catered to this new demand for spectacular visibility. Lagerfeld, in a stroke of marketing genius, took the dusty codes of Chanel, the tweed suit, the pearls, the quilted bag, and blew them up to cartoonish proportions, layering them with gold chains and logos, making them legible and desirable to a new global audience. He understood that in the 80s, subtlety was death. The brand had to be seen, the wealth had to be performed, and couture was the ultimate stage for that performance. The very architecture of the couture show began to mutate during this period, moving from the intimate, salon-style presentations of the past to something far more theatrical. The runway became a stage, the models became actresses, and the collection became a narrative. This was a crucial transition, because it acknowledged that the primary audience for couture was no longer the handful of clients in attendance, but the vast, unseen audience of television cameras and fashion photographers. The show itself became the product, a piece of performance art designed to generate images that would cascade through the global media ecosystem. The clothes were, in a sense, props in this larger drama. This laid the groundwork for the even more explosive theatricality of the 1990s, but the seeds were sown in the 80s, in the understanding that couture's survival depended on its ability to spectacularize itself. It had to become more than just clothes. It had to become an event, a myth, a cultural moment. The logic was simple. The more outrageous, the more fantastical, the more unwearable the garment on the runway, the more powerful the image it generated. And that image was the fuel for the entire luxury machine. It sold the fantasy that, in turn, sold the lipstick. It was a brilliant, cynical, and utterly effective strategy that resurrected a dying art form by transforming it into the high-concept marketing wing of global capitalism. Couture was no longer in the business of dressing bodies. It was in the business of producing signs of wealth, signs of power, signs of fantasy, in a world increasingly governed by the logic of the image. As the brazen, neon-lit optimism of the 1980s crashed against the economic realities of the early 1990s recession, fashion underwent a profound and schizophrenic shift. The flamboyant excess of Lacroix and the power-shouldered hubris of the yuppie uniform suddenly looked garish, out of touch, almost embarrassing. A powerful counter-movement emerged, a call for sobriety, for realism, for a kind of brutalist honesty in clothing. This was the era of minimalism, championed by designers like Helmut Lang and Jill Sander, and the raw, deconstructed aesthetic of the Antwerp Six. It was the era of grunge, with its thrift store flannels and ripped jeans, a sartorial expression of disillusionment and angst. In this new, stripped-down landscape, the opulent dream of couture seemed, once again, destined for the grave. And yet, something extraordinary happened. Instead of dying, couture doubled down. It responded to the challenge of minimalism not by retreating, but by becoming even more extreme, more theatrical, more disconnected from the realities of everyday life. If the 80s revived couture as a spectacle of wealth, the 90s elevated it into a realm of pure, unadulterated fantasy, a laboratory for the most radical and challenging ideas in fashion. The decade witnessed the rise of a new generation of couturiers who treated the runway not as a showroom, but as a stage for performance art, for psychodrama, for the articulation of complex, often disturbing narratives. At the forefront of this new theatricality were two British designers, two brilliant, tormented visionaries who were installed at the helm of Paris's most storied couture houses, John Galliano at Givenchy and later Christian Dior, and Alexander McQueen at Givenchy. Their appointments were, in themselves, a radical act, a deliberate injection of anarchic, street-savvy British talent into the staid, formal world of Parisian couture, and they did not disappoint. Galliano, the romantic historian, transformed the Dior Couture show into an immersive narrative experience. Each collection was a meticulously researched, exquisitely executed journey into a different world, a different fantasy. He drew on the decadent glamour of the Belle Époque, the exoticism of the Orient, the faded grandeur of Marchesa Casati, the melancholic romance of silent film stars. His models were not just walking hangers, they were characters in a play, their makeup, hair, and gestures all part of a larger story. The clothes themselves were masterpieces of construction, but their ultimate purpose was to serve the narrative. A dress was not just a dress. It was the embodiment of a feeling, a memory, a dream. His infamous Clochards, or Homeless Child collection for Dior in 2000, inspired by the downtrodden figures he saw along the Seine, was a perfect example of this. It was controversial, of course, accused of aestheticizing poverty, but it was also a profound statement about the nature of beauty, finding it in the most unlikely of places, in the deconstructed, layered garments of the dispossessed. Galliano proved that couture could be more than just pretty dresses. It could be a powerful, provocative storytelling medium. If Galliano was the romantic poet of 90s couture, then Alexander McQueen was its dark, gothic surgeon. His vision was altogether more brutal, more confrontational, and more deeply personal. Where Galliano created beautiful dreams, McQueen staged mesmerizing nightmares. His work was a raw, visceral exploration of themes of trauma, power, sexuality, and death, often drawing on his own life story and the darker chapters of history. His shows were legendary for their aggressive, often frightening theatricality. In Highland Rape, Autumn-Winter 1995, he sent models down the runway in torn lace and tartan, stumbling as if they had been brutalized, a furious commentary on England's historical subjugation of Scotland. For Givenchy, he presented collections that featured models as cyborgs with glowing circuit boards on their skin, or as asylum inmates in a padded cell. His Spring-Summer 1999 show for his own label culminated in one of the most iconic moments in fashion history, the model Shalom Harlow, standing on a rotating platform in a simple white dress, being sprayed with paint by two industrial robots in a terrifying and beautiful dance between woman and machine. McQueen used the techniques of couture, the exquisite tailoring, the intricate beadwork, the mastery of fabric, not to create conventional beauty, but to articulate a vision of a savage beauty, one that found sublimity in the grotesque, the uncanny, and the terrifying. For McQueen, the body was a site of contestation, of vulnerability and strength, and his clothes were a way of dissecting, exposing, and ultimately empowering it. He dragged couture out of the drawing room and into the operating theater, the asylum, the abattoir, proving that it could be a vehicle for the most profound and disturbing artistic expression. This radical theatricality was not confined to Galliano and McQueen. The 1990s saw a flourishing of designers who pushed the boundaries of what a couture show could be. Thierry Mugler, for instance, created hyper-stylized, fetishistic fantasies that transformed women into otherworldly creatures, insects, goddesses, cyborgs. His shows were massive, stadium-sized spectacles, more akin to a rock concert or a Broadway production than a traditional fashion presentation. He celebrated a powerful, almost bionic femininity, with corsetry and sculpted silhouettes that exaggerated the human form into something superhuman. Jean-Paul Gaultier, the enfant terrible of Paris, brought a playful postmodern wit to couture, subverting traditional codes of gender and beauty, putting men in skirts and celebrating unconventional models of all ages, shapes, and sizes. He mixed high and low culture, drawing inspiration from the street, from punk, from global cultures, and filtering it through the exquisite craftsmanship of the couture ateliers. What all these designers shared was a fundamental understanding that couture's relevance in the modern world lay in its ability to generate meaning, to provoke emotion, and to create unforgettable images. The clothes themselves were almost secondary to the concepts they embodied and the spectacle they created. Couture had become a form of conceptual art, a space for pure creativity, untethered by the commercial constraints of ready-to-wear. And here we arrive at the central paradox, the economic engine that powered this entire fantastical enterprise. How could these incredibly expensive, commercially non-viable shows possibly be sustained? The answer lies in the consolidation of the luxury industry into powerful conglomerates like LVMH and Kering, then known as PPR. These corporations, led by shrewd businessmen like Bernard Arnault, understood the new logic of luxury. They recognized that haute couture, while a loss leader in itself, the cost of the shows and the ateliers far outstripped the revenue from the handful of dresses sold, was the most powerful marketing tool imaginable. The theatrical, headline-grabbing couture show created a halo effect for the entire brand. The images of Galliano's tragic heroines or McQueen's savage beauties were splashed across newspapers and magazines worldwide, creating an aura of creativity, prestige, and desirability around the brand name, be it Dior, Givenchy, or Gaultier. This aura, this dream, was then used to sell the highly profitable mass market items: the perfumes, the cosmetics, the handbags, the sunglasses. A woman might not be able to afford a $50,000 Dior gown, but she could buy a $100 Dior lipstick and feel that she was participating in Galliano's fantasy. Couture, in this sense, became the research and development department of the brand's imagination. It was the spectacular, money-losing engine that fueled the entire multi-billion-dollar profit machine. This cynical symbiosis between pure creativity and shrewd commerce is the defining feature of late 20th century couture. The art and the ad became indistinguishable, each feeding the other in a perpetual cycle of spectacle and consumption. So, when we speak of the revival of couture in the 80s and 90s, we are not speaking of a simple return to a past glory. We are describing a fundamental reinvention of its purpose and meaning. It was a mutation, a strategic adaptation to a new cultural and economic environment. In the 80s, it adapted to the logic of conspicuous consumption and the new media landscape, becoming a platform for the performance of wealth. In the 90s, it adapted to a fractured cultural landscape by splintering into poles of minimalism and maximalism, and the maximalist camp, the couture camp, survived by becoming a space for pure artistic expression, a form of performance art that served as the ideological and aesthetic fountainhead for massive global brands. It ceased to be primarily about the relationship between a couturier and a private client and became about the relationship between a designer's imagination and a global media audience. The client was no longer the woman in the front row, but the millions watching on television or seeing the images in a magazine. The dress was no longer an object to be worn, but an image to be consumed. This transformation was both a triumph and a tragedy. A triumph, in that it saved an extraordinary craft from extinction and gave a platform to some of the most brilliant creative minds of the century, but also a tragedy, in that it untethered couture from its original purpose, turning it into a beautiful, extravagant, and ultimately hollow spectacle at the service of commerce. The ghost in the machine was not just revived, it was put to work, haunting the global marketplace with its sublime and profitable dreams. Let us delve deeper into the semiotics of this transformation, for the shift was not merely economic or aesthetic, it was a profound reconfiguration of the language of fashion itself. The couture of the 1980s, particularly Lacroix's brand of opulent historicism, functioned as a kind of nostalgic escapism, but an escapism with a distinctly contemporary political charge. By plundering the wardrobes of the Ancien Régime, the Second Empire, and the Belle Époque, Lacroix was not simply creating pretty dresses. He was invoking eras of aristocratic certainty and unapologetic luxury in an age, the 1980s, that was desperately trying to forge its own new aristocracy of wealth. The pouf skirt with its echoes of the crinoline was a symbolic inflation, a visual metaphor for the booming stock market and the inflated egos of the new financial elite. It was a garment that physically prevented intimacy, that demanded space, that announced its own artifice. It was, in a Baudrillardian sense, a hyper-real garment, a copy of a historical form that was more real, more potent, than the original because its meaning was entirely rooted in the present moment of its consumption. It was history worn as costume, a way for new money to purchase the cultural legitimacy of old money. This was a direct contradiction to the modernist project of the 20th century, which sought to strip away ornament and historical reference in search of a pure, functional form. The 80s couture revival was a postmodern declaration that history was a toy box, a collection of styles to be mixed and matched, emptied of their original context and redeployed as signifiers of taste and, above all, wealth. This use of historical pastiche was then radicalized in the 1990s by designers like Galliano. His approach was different from Lacroix's joyful, almost naive eclecticism. Galliano's historicism was deeply narrative and often tinged with melancholy and decay. He wasn't just referencing a historical period, he was attempting to resurrect its soul, its psychodrama. His collections were less about quoting historical silhouettes and more about channeling the ghosts of history. When he created a collection inspired by the Marchesa Casati, the early 20th century eccentric and patron of the arts, he wasn't just making dresses that looked like hers. He was trying to capture her spirit of decadent, theatrical self-creation, her ambition to be a living work of art. The runway became a seance, and the clothes were the ectoplasm. This represents a more complex relationship with the past. It's not just a source of decorative motifs, but a wellspring of narrative, character, and emotion. It acknowledges that history is not just a collection of beautiful objects, but a repository of human stories, of tragedy, desire, and madness. This turn towards narrative marks a critical evolution in couture's function. If 80s couture was about broadcasting a static message of, I am wealthy, 90s couture was about telling a story, inviting the audience into a complex, immersive world. The value of the garment was no longer just in its materials or its price tag, but in its connection to the larger narrative universe created by the designer. Contrast this with the work of Alexander McQueen, whose engagement with history was one of violent confrontation rather than romantic immersion. McQueen's historical references were often to moments of brutality and conflict, such as in his Highland Rape collection. By restaging this historical trauma on the runway, he forced a confrontation with the often sanitized, romanticized version of history that fashion so loves to consume. He used the language of couture, a language associated with elegance, refinement, and civility, to speak of violence, violation, and rebellion. This was a profoundly subversive act. He demonstrated that the techniques of the atelier, the precise cut of a jacket, the delicate drape of a fabric, could be used to express not just beauty, but pain and rage. His work constantly interrogated the relationship between creator and creation, power and victimhood, beauty and horror. The famous robot spray painting dress is a perfect distillation of this. It is a moment of creation, but it is also a moment of assault. The model is passive, vulnerable, a target, yet the resulting garment is undeniably beautiful. Is this a metaphor for the creative process? A commentary on the violence of the male gaze? A vision of technological sublime? It is all of these things at once. McQueen's genius was to use the couture show as a space to ask these difficult, unsettling questions, refusing to provide easy answers. He politicized the runway, turning it into a site of ideological struggle, where the very definition of beauty was contested. We must also consider the body itself as a central text in this discourse. The ideal body in 80s power dressing and couture was an augmented architectural one. The shoulder pads created a formidable V-shaped torso, a silhouette of pure, unapologetic power. The poof skirt and opulent draperies of couture similarly extended the body's presence, turning it into a grand, sculptural object. The body was, in essence, a pedestal for the display of fabric and the signification of status. In the 90s, this conception of the body was shattered and reassembled in myriad ways. The minimalism of Lang or Sonder sought an almost erased body, a neutral framework for the purity of the garment's line. But in the theatrical couture of McQueen, Mugler, and Galliano, the body became a site of radical transformation and mutation. Mugler's cyborgs and insect women, with their wasp waists and exoskeletal corsetry, envisioned a post-human body, a fusion of flesh and machine, nature and technology. This was a body that was not natural, but constructed, a fantasy of power and control. McQueen, on the other hand, often presented a body that was vulnerable, wounded, or grotesque. He introduced the bumster trouser, which sat so low on the hips that it revealed the cleavage of the buttocks, a gesture that was both provocative and strangely de-eroticizing, exposing a part of the body not traditionally sexualized. He was fascinated by disability and physical difference, challenging the normative ideals of beauty that fashion relentlessly perpetuates. In his hands, couture became a tool for anatomical and psychological exploration, a way of remaking the human form to reveal its hidden anxieties and desires. This entire efflorescence of creative energy was, paradoxically, predicated on the increasing irrelevance of couture as a practical form of dress. As the number of actual couture clients dwindled to a few hundred globally, the designers were liberated from the need to make wearable, functional clothing. This freedom was the key. Couture became a protected space, a state-funded, via the profits from licensing and accessories, artistic research program. The designers could afford to take risks, to experiment with form, material, and concept in ways that would be impossible in the commercially driven world of ready-to-wear. The couture show became an ideas factory, a place where the brand's aesthetic DNA for the coming season was forged in its most extreme and undiluted form. The themes, silhouettes, and moods presented in the couture collection would then be translated, simplified, and commercialized into the ready-to-wear lines, the accessories, the ad campaigns, and even the store design. So the unwearable dress on the couture runway was, in fact, the most hard-working garment of all. Its job was not to be worn, but to generate the ideas, the images, and the mythology that would sustain the entire brand ecosystem. This is the central logic that allowed the spectacular, narrative-driven couture of the 90s to flourish. It was a beautiful, necessary indulgence, the dream work that kept the wheels of commerce turning. Therefore, to understand this period is to understand a complex interplay of forces. The economic boom of the 80s creating a new class of consumer hungry for visible status symbols. The rise of global media creating a new demand for spectacular imagery. The consolidation of luxury brands into powerful conglomerates, providing the financial backing for the spectacle. And the emergence of a generation of uniquely gifted designers who seized this opportunity to push the boundaries of fashion as an art form. The revival of couture was not a single event, but a cascade of interconnected phenomena. It was a story of art and commerce, of nostalgia and futurism, of romanticism and brutality, of the celebration of wealth and the critique of power. It was the moment when fashion, in its most rarefied and exclusive form, became a central protagonist in the grand theater of late 20th century culture, a glittering, complex, and often contradictory mirror reflecting the anxieties and aspirations of an era. The legacy of this period is still with us today, in the celebrity-driven spectacle of the red carpet, in the blockbuster museum exhibitions dedicated to fashion designers, and in the fundamental understanding that a luxury brand sells not a product, but a story, a dream, a universe. And at the heart of that universe, burning with an impossible, extravagant light, is the ghost of haute couture, forever reanimated, forever performing its beautiful, profitable, and necessary fantasies. Let's dissect further the psychological underpinnings of this dramatic shift, because the return to opulence in the 1980s was not merely a matter of taste or economics, it was a psychic necessity. The 1970s, with its earth tones, its fluid, unstructured silhouettes, and its intellectual embrace of anti-fashion, was a decade of introversion and doubt, a hangover from the failed revolutions of the 1960s. The clothing reflected a certain societal melancholy, a turning inward. The explosive arrival of 80s couture, therefore, can be read as a form of collective mania, a desperate, almost hysterical assertion of confidence in the face of underlying anxieties about nuclear war, economic instability, and the AIDS crisis. The sheer volume of a Lacroix skirt, the blinding glint of a Lagerfeld gold chain, the aggressive breadth of a Thierry Mugler shoulder, these were all sartorial defense mechanisms. They were attempts to project an image of invulnerability, to build a fortress of fabric around the fragile self. The philosophy was one of externalization. If you looked powerful, successful, and joyful, you would become it. This is the logic of magical thinking, and 80s couture was its ultimate talisman. It was a Freudian return of the repressed, where all the ornament, color, and extravagance that had been suppressed by modernist good taste came roaring back with a vengeance. The fashion of the era was loud because the culture was loud, engaged in a collective shouting match to drown out the whispers of its own insecurities. This psychic landscape becomes even more complex and fractured in the 1990s. The stark division between the austere minimalism of a designer like Helmut Lang and the narrative maximalism of John Galliano is not just an aesthetic disagreement. It represents a fundamental schism in the cultural psyche. Minimalism can be interpreted as a form of aesthetic penance for the sins of 80s excess. It was about purification, about stripping away the lies of ornament to find a kind of truth in the garment's essential form. It was a fashion of quiet confidence, of intellectual rigor, for those who didn't need to shout their status. It was, in its own way, a new form of exclusivity, an if you know, quiet luxury that was just as much about class distinction as the logomania it replaced. On the other hand, the theatrical couture of Galliano and McQueen represented a flight into fantasy, an escape from a reality that was seen as either too boring or too brutal. If minimalism sought truth in the real, maximalism sought it in the dream. This is where psychoanalysis becomes an essential tool for interpretation. Galliano's work, with its romantic heroines and tragic narratives, can be seen as a form of wish fulfillment, a staging of collective desires for romance, beauty, and adventure. He created a world that was more beautiful, more intense, and more meaningful than the real one. McQueen's psychodramas, however, operated on a different level. They were not escapist fantasies, but rather a confrontation with the traumatic real, the Lacanian concept of the unrepresentable horror that underpins our symbolic reality. His shows were often a controlled return of a repressed collective trauma, violence against women, the brutality of history, the anxieties of technological dehumanization. By staging these nightmares in the beautiful, controlled environment of a couture show, he performed a kind of aesthetic psychoanalysis. He forced the audience to look at what they would rather ignore, but he did so through the mediating, beautifying lens of high fashion. This created a powerful tension, an experience of the uncanny, where the familiar, a beautiful dress, is made strange and unsettling. The savage beauty of his work lies precisely in this friction between sublime craftsmanship and disturbing subject matter. He was not offering an escape from reality, but a deeper, more terrifying, and ultimately more cathartic immersion in it. His work did not allow for passive consumption. It demanded an emotional and intellectual response, implicating the viewer in the difficult scenes unfolding before them. This is what elevated his work from fashion to art, its capacity to function as a complex psychological text, rich with symbolism and open to multiple, often conflicting interpretations. Furthermore, we must interrogate the role of the re-emergent luxury conglomerates in this psychological economy. The actions of a figure like Bernard Arnault were not those of a traditional patron of the arts. He was a master strategist playing a game of symbolic capitalism. By installing radical, often volatile talents like Galliano and McQueen at the head of heritage houses like Dior and Givenchy, he was performing a high-stakes act of brand necromancy. These houses, before their arrival, were respectable but largely dormant, coasting on the fumes of past glories and perfume sales. Arnault understood that in the crowded marketplace of the 90s, respectability was not enough. A brand needed to be relevant, exciting, even dangerous. It needed to be part of the cultural conversation. Galliano and McQueen were the instruments of this relevance. Their controversial, headline-grabbing shows were a form of shock therapy for the brands, jolting them back to life. Arnault was, in essence, buying not just their design skills, but their cultural energy, their cool, their authenticity. He created a firebreak between the chaotic, creative genius in the couture studio and the cool, calculating logic of the corporate boardroom. The designers were allowed, even encouraged, to run wild, to create their most extreme fantasies, because the corporation understood that this very extremism was the raw material that could be refined into profitable commodities down the line. It was a new model of corporate patronage, one that fostered and exploited artistic rebellion for commercial gain. The relationship was symbiotic, but it was also deeply parasitic. The designers were given unprecedented freedom and resources, but they were also under immense pressure to continuously produce spectacular, headline-generating novelty, a pressure that would ultimately take a devastating personal toll on both Galliano and McQueen. The system that enabled their genius was also the system that consumed them. This brings us to a critical reevaluation of the term revival. A revival implies a return to a previous state of health, but what occurred in couture was not a return. It was a radical, irreversible mutation. The couture of the 1950s, the so-called Golden Age, was a system based on a certain social reality, a world of debutante balls, grand soirees, and a class of women whose primary occupation was the performance of leisured elegance. The system was hermetic, with a direct and tangible link between the creator and the client. The 80s and 90s shattered this model. The new couture was not a closed loop, but a broadcast system. Its purpose was to radiate meaning outwards, to function as the symbolic sun around which the planets of fragrance, accessories, and ready-to-wear would orbit. This new system had a different relationship to time. Where old couture was about creating timeless heirlooms, the new couture was about creating timely, unforgettable moments. The success of a show was measured not by the number of orders placed, but by the volume of media coverage it generated, by its ability to create an image that would lodge itself in the collective cultural memory. The Shalom Harlow robot dress, Galliano's Diorient Express train arrival, Mugler's supersized angel wings, these were not just clothes, they were manufactured moments of cultural history. They were designed for the camera, for reproduction, for dissemination. The aura of the original garment, in the Walter Benjamin sense, was less important than the ubiquity of its image. This marks couture's full entry into the age of mechanical and later digital reproduction. It survived by sacrificing its essence as a private craft and embracing its new identity as a generator of public spectacle. It was a Faustian bargain, trading its soul for a new, spectacular, and immensely profitable form of life. Let us pull on the thread of materiality, for the discourse of couture is always, at its base, a discourse about fabric, about the hand, about the alchemical transformation of cloth into form. The 80s opulence was a celebration of fabrics that announced their own expense. The rustle of taffeta, the sheen of silk satin, the weight of velvet, the sparkle of embroidery. These were materials that engaged the senses in a direct and unambiguous performance of luxury. Lacroix's genius was not just in his silhouettes, but in his audacious mixing of these materials, in his clash of patterns and textures that broke all the rules of conventional good taste. He layered Provençal prints with Baroque brocades, trimmed with lace, feathers, and passementerie. This was a material maximalism that mirrored the economic maximalism of the era. It was a feast for the eyes, a sensory overload that communicated a message of abundance and joyful excess. The craftsmanship was there, in the hand-rolled hems and the intricate draping, but it was placed in the service of an aesthetic that prioritized immediate visual impact over quiet, subtle perfection. The value was on the surface, dazzling and self-evident. The 90s, however, witnessed a more complex and often perverse relationship with materiality. The great couturiers of this decade treated their materials not just as signifiers of luxury, but as narrative agents, as substances to be experimented with, tortured, and transformed. Alexander McQueen was perhaps the master of this. He would take the most noble of materials, cashmere, silk, lace, and subject them to brutal treatments, tearing them, burning them, burying them in the ground to age and decay. He also incorporated unconventional, often abject materials into the couture vocabulary: horsehair, medical slides, razor clamshells, taxidermied birds. In his hands, a dress of pheasant feathers was not just a beautiful object. It was a memento mori, a reminder of the proximity of life and death, beauty and decay. He challenged the very definition of a luxury material. Is a piece of wood, hand-carved into a prosthetic leg and worn as part of a couture ensemble, less luxurious than a diamond? He forced us to reconsider where value lies, in the intrinsic worth of the material, or in the transformative power of the artist's vision and the artisan's hand? This was a radical interrogation of the commodity fetishism that underpins the entire luxury industry. John Galliano, too, had a storyteller's approach to fabric. His use of bias cutting, a technique resurrected from the 1930s, was not just a technical feat. It was a way of imbuing fabric with a sense of liquid, melancholic glamour. A Galliano bias-cut gown did not just hang on the body. It clung, it slithered, it moved with a life of its own, evoking the languid, sensuous elegance of another era. He would distress fabrics, tea-staining them to give them the patina of age, making a brand-new gown look like a treasured, ghostly heirloom. His choice of materials was always in service of the narrative. For his clochards collection, he used scraps of old Dior newsprint fabric, crumpled and layered to mimic the makeshift garments of the homeless, a gesture that was both a piece of brand mythology, using the house's own history as a raw material, and a provocative statement about waste and value. Thierry Mugler, in contrast, pushed materials in a futuristic direction. He was a pioneer in the use of industrial materials like PVC, vinyl, and plexiglass in a couture context, sculpting them into rigid exoskeletal forms that seemed to merge the body with technology. His work celebrated the artificial, the synthetic, the man-made, creating a vision of a future where the distinction between skin and plastic, human and machine, would be gloriously blurred. The materiality of 90s couture, therefore, was not a monolithic statement of wealth, but a diverse and complex language used to tell stories, explore psychological states, and challenge our very definitions of what is precious, what is beautiful, and what is fashion. This focus on the narrative and conceptual power of couture leads to another crucial point: the changing role of the model. In the classical couture salon, the model was a mannequin, a deliberately blank canvas whose job was to display the clothes to their best advantage without distracting from them. The 80s, with the rise of the supermodel, began to change this, but it was in the 90s that the model was fully transformed from a passive object into an active subject, a performer in the designer's psychodrama. The casting for a Galliano or McQueen show was as crucial as the design of the clothes. They sought out models with unique, expressive faces, with a sense of character and attitude. Kate Moss, Shalom Harlow, Stella Tennant, Kristen McMenemy. These were not just beautiful women. They were chameleons, actresses capable of embodying the complex personas required by the collections. The walk, the gestures, the makeup, the hair, every element was choreographed to contribute to the overall narrative. A model in a McQueen show might be asked to walk with a limp, to stare with aggression, to convey a sense of terror or ecstasy. In Galliano's shows, they might adopt the theatrical poses of a silent film star or the weary grandeur of a fallen aristocrat. This transformed the runway from a simple procession into a piece of living theater. It also acknowledged the model's own agency and power in the creation of the fashion image. The image that lasts is not just of the dress, but of Kate Moss in that dress, of Shalom Harlow being painted by the robots. The fusion of the specific garment with the specific performer is what created the indelible cultural moment. This elevation of the model into a co-creator of meaning was a definitive feature of 90s couture, further cementing its status as a form of performance art. It was a recognition that the dream of couture is ultimately worn not on the client's body, but on the spectacular, mediated body of the model, the living icon of the brand's fantasy. We begin then, not with a definition, but with an autopsy, or perhaps more accurately, a seance. For to speak of haute couture in the 21st century is to speak of a ghost, a phantom limb of the fashion system whose persistent spectral ache reminds the body of what it has supposedly lost: authenticity, artistry, the human touch. The narrative you have been sold, the one repeated in glossy magazines and hushed documentaries, is that of a dying art form, a beautiful relic gasping for air in the polluted atmosphere of fast fashion, globalized supply chains, and digital immediacy. This narrative is comforting. It is elegiac, and it is almost entirely wrong. It mistakes the transformation of a logic for the death of a body. Haute couture is not dead. It has merely become a more intelligent, more virulent, more complex phantom, its power lying not in its material presence in the closets of the ultra-wealthy, but in its ideological presence as the organizing principle, the gold standard, the sacred and untouchable core from which the entire profane logic of contemporary fashion radiates and derives its value. It is the sun that no one can look at directly, but whose gravity secretly holds the entire vulgar system of ready-to-wear, diffusion lines, and licensed fragrances in its orbit. To understand couture now is not to count the number of clients or to marvel at the hours of hand-stitching, but to dissect the mechanisms of its spectral power, to ask how this anachronism, this beautiful, monstrous, economically absurd creature, has managed to weaponize its own obsolescence into the ultimate form of contemporary cultural capital. The first and most obvious site of this spectral haunting is the atelier's fraught and paradoxical embrace of technology. We are told that couture is the sanctum of the hand, the domain of the petite mains, those anonymous craftspeople whose monastic devotion to the needle and thread is presented as a form of sacred ritual. Yet, into this sanctum walks the algorithm, the 3D printer, the laser cutter, the digital loom. Think of the work of Iris van Herpen, a designer who is less a couturier in the traditional sense and more of a speculative architect for the body. Her creations, which seem to be coaxed from pure data, grown in a digital petri dish and solidified from light and polymer, are a direct assault on the romantic mythology of the handmade. But this is not a simple replacement of the old with the new. It is a far more disturbing and fascinating synthesis. The 3D printer in the couture house does not operate as it does in a factory, churning out identical objects. Instead, it is subjugated to the logic of the unique. It is forced to produce a single, unrepeatable form, a garment whose digital file is arguably as complex and singular as a traditional paper pattern. The algorithm becomes a new kind of petite main, an invisible incorporeal artisan whose hand is a line of code and whose stitch is a fired laser beam. This fusion destabilizes our most cherished binaries: human versus machine, craft versus code, tradition versus innovation. What does it mean for a garment to be handmade when the hand guiding the process is that of a software engineer, and the material itself is a photopolymer resin that has never known a silkworm or a cotton field? The resulting object is a kind of exquisite paradox, a testament to machine precision that exists only to serve the cult of human singularity. It is a technological fetish object, its value derived not from its reproducibility, the very promise of technology, but from its technologically guaranteed uniqueness. This technological turn does more than just update the aesthetic. It fundamentally reconfigures the very concept of materiality in couture. We move from the familiar lexicon of silk, organza, and chiffon to a new, alien vocabulary of thermoplastic polyurethane, magnetic fabrics, and bioprinted textiles. These are not merely new materials. They are intelligent materials, materials that carry their own logic, their own potential for movement and transformation, inscribed within their very molecular structure. A dress is no longer a static object draped upon a passive body. It can become a kinetic sculpture, an interactive interface, a second skin that breathes and responds to its environment. This is couture entering the realm of biopolitics. The garment ceases to be a mere covering and becomes a prosthesis, an extension of the body's own sensory apparatus. And in doing so, it raises profoundly unsettling questions about the boundaries of the self. If your dress can react to the gaze of another, if it can change shape based on your heartbeat, where does your body end and the garment begin? This is not just fashion, it is a form of applied philosophy, a material interrogation of post-humanism. The couture client is no longer just buying a dress. She is purchasing a piece of speculative biology, a wearable experiment in the future of the species. And this, of course, is the ultimate luxury in a world saturated with manufactured goods. The luxury of becoming, for a moment, a cyborg, a prototype for a new kind of human. The astronomical price tag is justified not by the hours of labor, though those are still immense, but by the conceptual density of the object. It's to signify its owner's participation in the vanguard of human evolution. The phantom of couture here is the phantom of the future, a future that can be worn, owned, and displayed as the ultimate status symbol. But to focus solely on the technological frontier is to miss the equally seismic shifts happening in couture's relationship with geography and culture. The historical heart of couture is, and remains, Paris, a city whose name is synonymous with a certain kind of exclusionary, hierarchical, and frankly colonial logic of taste. For decades, the Chambre syndicale de la haute couture operated as a gatekeeper, a centralized authority dictating not only the stringent rules of production, but also the very aesthetic of what could be considered couture. It was a closed system, a French court presiding over a global empire of style. The 21st century has witnessed the cracking of this monolithic facade, not through a violent revolution, but through a calculated and strategic inclusion of the other. Designers from China, from India, from the Middle East, from Africa are now invited to show on the official calendar, their work celebrated as a sign of couture's newfound global consciousness. But we must interrogate this narrative of benevolent multiculturalism. Is this a genuine decentralization of power, or is it a more sophisticated form of cultural appropriation, a neo-colonial venture where the craft traditions of the periphery are brought to the center, stripped of their original context, and repackaged for consumption by a global elite? Consider the breathtaking embroidery of a designer like Rahul Mishra, which draws on centuries of Indian craft tradition. When this work is shown in Paris, under the banner of haute couture, what is happening? It is undeniably beautiful, it is undeniably masterful, but its entry into the Parisian system requires a form of translation. The cultural and spiritual significance of the craft is sublimated, and its aesthetic qualities are amplified. It becomes legible to the Western gaze, its value authenticated not by its own history, but by the imprimatur of the French fashion establishment. The global designer, in this sense, is caught in a double bind. To be recognized, they must submit to the validation of the very system that historically excluded their traditions. They must perform their authenticity in a way that is palatable and desirable to the global market. Couture, then, becomes a theater of globalization, a stage where cultural difference is performed, aestheticized, and ultimately commodified. The inclusion is not a dissolution of the center. It is an expansion of the center's power to absorb and re-signify the periphery. This performance of globalism is intrinsically linked to the changing identity of the couture client and the shifting nature of luxury itself. The traditional image of the couture client, the discreet old-money heiress who ordered a full wardrobe for her cloistered seasonal life, is as outdated as the horse and carriage. The new couture client is a far more public and globally dispersed figure. The tech billionaire from Silicon Valley, the Chinese industrialist, the Russian oligarch, the Nollywood superstar. These are not clients who are buying clothes to be worn at private garden parties. They are buying them to be seen, to be photographed, to be broadcast across the digital ether. This has precipitated a fundamental shift in the function of the couture garment, from a private pleasure to a public spectacle. The primary site of couture's existence is no longer the fitting room or the ballroom, but the red carpet and the Instagram feed. This is the age of what we might call couture as image. The garment's value is increasingly measured not by its tactile qualities or its perfect fit, but by its photographability, its capacity to create a viral moment, to generate clicks, likes, and shares. This creates a new set of aesthetic demands. The design must be bold, graphic, and instantly legible on a tiny phone screen. Nuance, subtlety, and delicate detail, the historical hallmarks of couture, are sacrificed in favor of grand theatrical gestures. Enormous trains, exaggerated silhouettes, blindingly bright colors. The dress becomes a piece of personal branding, an armor of spectacle designed to compete in the brutal attention economy of social media. It exists less as a physical object and more as a digital artifact, a JPEG that circulates endlessly, detached from the body that once wore it. The psychoanalytic implications of this are profound. If the garment's primary purpose is to be looked at, to be consumed by the disembodied gaze of millions, then the wearer is transformed into a kind of living mannequin, a vehicle for the circulation of the image. The experience of wearing the dress becomes secondary to the experience of being seen in the dress. This is the logic of the Lacanian gaze, writ large in silk and sequins. The client is buying not a piece of clothing, but a moment of sublime visibility, a confirmation of her own existence in the relentless, judging eyes of the digital world. This economy of the image forces couture houses to operate as media companies as much as fashion ateliers. The runway show itself has morphed from an intimate presentation for buyers and press into a multi-million-dollar content creation event. The set design, the celebrity guest list, the soundtrack, the social media strategy, all are as meticulously crafted as the garments themselves. The show is a ritual designed to produce a cascade of images that will flood the cultural landscape for months, reinforcing the brand's hegemonic status. The few dozen dresses on the runway are, in a sense, the loss leaders. Their purpose is not to be sold, though some will be, but to generate the aura of unattainable desire that will then be used to sell millions of units of lipstick, perfume, and handbags. The couture collection is the sacred text, and the ready-to-wear and accessories are the mass-market translations. This is the central economic paradox of modern couture. Its financial viability depends on its commercial inviability. It must be seen as being above commerce in order to perform its commercial function effectively. It must stage a convincing performance of pure, unadulterated creativity, of art for art's sake, in order to fuel the vast, global machine of luxury capitalism. The phantom of couture is the phantom of authenticity itself, an authenticity that is meticulously staged, strategically deployed, and ultimately the most valuable commodity of all. We are not just witnessing a fashion show, we are witnessing a sophisticated act of ideological production, a ceremony where economic power is laundered into cultural legitimacy. Furthermore, this relentless pressure to generate spectacular, image-ready content has had a curious effect on couture's relationship with its own history. We are living in an age of the archive, a moment of obsessive self-referentiality across all cultural forms. In couture, this manifests as a constant and often violent dialogue with the ghosts of the past. A creative director today is less a pure originator and more a curator, a DJ, a medium who channels and remixes the codes of the house's founder. John Galliano at Maison Margiela is not just designing clothes. He is performing a continuous deconstruction of Martin Margiela's own deconstructivist philosophy. Demna at Balenciaga is not simply paying homage to Cristobal Balenciaga's architectural volumes. He is placing them in a new, uncanny context of dystopian celebrity culture and digital alienation. This is not nostalgia, it is a form of critical haunting, or what the theorist Mark Fisher might call hauntology. The past is not a stable, comforting presence. It is a restless ghost that must be constantly wrestled with, reinterpreted, and sometimes exorcised. The archive becomes a playground, but also a prison. The designer must innovate, but only within the established vocabulary of the brand. They must be original, but also recognizably Dior or Chanel. This tension creates a fascinating dynamic, where collections become meta-commentaries on the history of fashion itself. A dress might feature a silhouette from the 1950s, rendered in a 3D printed material, and worn by a model in a way that references a 1990s runway show. It is a palimpsest of historical references, a garment that is saturated with its own past. This archival obsession speaks to a deeper cultural anxiety. In a world of fleeting digital images and perpetual presentness, the couture archive offers a sense of permanence, of lineage, of a story that transcends the ephemeral trends of the season. Owning a piece of modern couture is not just buying a new dress, it is buying a piece of that history, a tangible link to a semi-mythical past. The phantom here is the phantom of time itself, a past that is not truly past, but is constantly erupting into the present, demanding to be reworn and reimagined. This deep engagement with the archive also serves to attract a younger, more culturally literate clientele. While the traditional couture customer might have been interested in craftsmanship and exclusivity, the new generation of wealthy consumers is often drawn to the brand's narrative, its cultural resonance, its cool factor. They are fluent in the language of semiotics and deconstruction, even if they don't use those terms. They understand that a Balenciaga coat is not just a coat, but a statement about celebrity, media, and the nature of reality. They appreciate the intellectual games being played by the designers. The couture house, in turn, must learn to speak their language. This is why we see collaborations that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. Couture houses partnering with streetwear brands, with tech companies, with contemporary artists. These collaborations are not just marketing gimmicks. They are acts of cultural translation, designed to signal that the brand is not a dusty museum piece, but a living, breathing participant in contemporary culture. The inclusion of menswear in the haute couture schedule, a relatively recent development, is another key strategy. It recognizes that the performance of extreme luxury is no longer exclusively a female domain. It opens up a new market, and more importantly, it allows the brand to engage with the complex and evolving codes of modern masculinity. The male couture client is not buying a bespoke suit in the traditional Savile Row sense. He is buying a piece of wearable art, an object that signifies his cultural capital and his distance from the drab conformity of corporate menswear. This is couture adapting to a world where identity is fluid, where taste is a marker of intellectual superiority, and where the ultimate luxury is the freedom to construct one's own self through a carefully curated assemblage of high-concept objects. Let us return then to the initial proposition, that couture is a ghost. We have seen how this ghost haunts the machine, whispering the logic of uniqueness into the ear of the algorithm. We have seen how it haunts the globe, drawing peripheral craft into its centralizing orbit. We have seen how it haunts the digital image, demanding ever more spectacular forms to capture the fleeting gaze of the network. And we have seen how it haunts the archive, endlessly reanimating the past to give meaning to the present. But what is the ultimate function of this haunting? It is to maintain a fantasy. The fantasy is that in our hyper-rationalized, mass-produced, late capitalist world, there is still a space for the irrational, the unique, the transcendent. Couture is the keeper of this fantasy. It is the material manifestation of the belief that art can exist outside of commerce, that human creativity can triumph over mechanical reproduction, that there is still such a thing as magic. Of course, this is an illusion, and a very expensive one. As we have seen, couture is deeply enmeshed in the very systems it pretends to transcend. It is a commercial enterprise of the highest order, a powerful engine of ideology, a theater of power. But its power lies in its ability to conceal its own workings, to present itself as a pure, untainted dream. To buy into couture, whether as a client, a journalist, or a mere spectator, is to agree to participate in this collective fantasy. It is to suspend disbelief and to allow oneself to be seduced by the beautiful ghost. The survival of haute couture in the 21st century, then, tells us less about the state of fashion and more about the state of our own desires. It reveals a deep and persistent longing for a world that is more beautiful, more meaningful, and more mysterious than the one we actually inhabit. Couture is the price we pay for that dream. And for the 1/10 of the 1% who can afford it, it is a price they are more than willing to pay. For the object they receive is not merely a dress, but a potent talisman against the profane disenchantment of modern life. This enchantment, however, is not a passive state, it is actively and relentlessly produced. The labor involved is not just the physical labor of the petites mains, but the emotional and intellectual labor of the entire apparatus. The creative director must not only be a designer, but also a storyteller, a mythmaker, a high priest of the brand's cult. The public relations teams must manage the delicate alchemy of exclusivity and visibility, ensuring the brand feels both unattainable and ever-present. The sales staff in the private salons must be part therapist, part confidant, part art advisor, guiding the client through a purchase that is as much an emotional journey as it is a financial transaction. The entire system is geared towards producing a sense of aura, a term Walter Benjamin used to describe the unique, quasi-religious authority of an original work of art. Benjamin famously argued that the age of mechanical reproduction would destroy this aura. But what he could not have predicted is that a system like haute couture would emerge that uses the tools of reproduction, photography, digital media, global logistics, not to destroy the aura, but to amplify it, to broadcast it, to make it even more potent and desirable. The modern couture garment is an object whose aura has been carefully constructed and globally distributed. It is a paradox, an aura designed for the age of its own supposed disappearance. This is perhaps the most cunning innovation of all, the industrialization of mystique. Let us dig deeper into the psychodrama of the fitting room, this private theater where the transaction culminates. It is a space that is both intimate and intensely political. Here, the client's body is subjected to a level of scrutiny that is almost medical in its precision. Dozens of measurements are taken, a custom mannequin is created in her exact image, and multiple toils, or prototypes, are made and refined. This process, which can take hundreds of hours, is a ritual of confirmation. The garment is not just made for the body, it is made to perfect the body, to correct its perceived flaws, to mold it into a more ideal version of itself. This is a form of biopower, in the Foucauldian sense. It is a gentle, luxurious, and consensual form of discipline, where the client willingly submits her body to the authority of the couturier's expert gaze. She is not just buying a dress, she is buying a better self, a version of her own body that has been elevated, refined, and sanctified by the touch of the couture house. The final garment is a testament to this transformative process. It is a second skin that is more perfect than the first, and in wearing it, the client experiences a feeling of profound rightness, a sense of her body finally being in harmony with its covering. This is the deep, psychophysical pleasure of couture, a pleasure that is inaccessible to the consumer of ready-to-wear, who must always force her non-standard body into a standardized size. The phantom of couture, in this intimate space, is the phantom of the perfect self, an idealized image that, for a fleeting moment, can be made real. This pursuit of perfection, this militant refusal of compromise, is what truly separates couture from all other forms of fashion. In a world defined by efficiency, by good enough, by the constant pressure to cut costs and speed up production, couture stands in radical opposition. It is a kingdom of inefficiency, a monument to the glorification of process. The value of a couture garment lies not just in its final form, but in the story of its own creation, the hundreds of hours of embroidery, the rare and precious materials, the obsessive quest for the perfect line. This narrative of heroic, almost pathological effort is a crucial part of the product. It is what allows the client to feel that she is acquiring not just a thing, but a piece of time, a concentration of human skill and dedication that is almost unimaginable in any other field of production. In this sense, couture is a form of performance art. The creation of the garment is the performance, and the client is the patron who commissions it. The atelier becomes a stage, and the petites mains are the uncredited actors in a drama of artisanal excellence. This theatricality is essential because it transforms a commercial transaction into a cultural one. The client is not a mere consumer. She is a patron of the arts, a custodian of tradition, a participant in a legacy of beauty. This reframing is a crucial ideological move. It elevates the act of extreme consumption into a noble and culturally virtuous act, shielding it from accusations of frivolity or excess. It is the ultimate defense mechanism of luxury, the magic trick that turns obscene wealth into exquisite taste. Let us now consider the sustainability paradox. In an era acutely aware of fashion's devastating environmental and social impact, haute couture presents itself as the ultimate slow fashion. A couture garment is not a disposable trend item. It is an heirloom, designed to be kept for generations. It is made with extraordinary care by fairly compensated artisans. On the surface, it appears to be the ethical antidote to the poison of the fast fashion industry. But this clean, virtuous image is, once again, a carefully constructed illusion. The world of haute couture is a world of extreme material indulgence. It relies on rare and exotic materials, flown in from all corners of the globe. The shows themselves are spectacles of immense waste, with elaborate sets built to be used for 20 minutes and then dismantled. More importantly, the ideological function of couture is to fuel the very system of desire and aspiration that drives the entire fashion cycle, including its most destructive, fast fashion expressions. Couture sits at the top of the pyramid, creating the trends and the dreams that are then diluted, copied, and mass-produced at lower price points. The desire for a Chanel handbag that drives a teenager to buy a cheap knockoff is born in the rarefied atmosphere of the couture show. Couture cannot, therefore, be absolved of the sins of the wider industry. It is not its opposite. It is its silent partner, its founding myth, its beautiful, complicit alibi. It provides the system with its romantic soul, allowing everyone else to get on with the dirty business of churning out product. The phantom of sustainability that couture projects is perhaps its most seductive and misleading ghost of all, a shimmering green veil that conceals a much more complex and compromised reality. This complicity extends to the very structure of desire that couture manufactures. By presenting a world of absolute perfection, of flawless beauty and effortless grace, couture necessarily creates a sense of lack and inadequacy in the spectator. The dream it sells is predicated on the viewer's exclusion from that dream. For the 99.99% of the population who will never own a piece of couture, its images serve as a constant reminder of their own imperfection, their own distance from the ideal. This is the engine of consumer capitalism. It functions by creating a perpetual state of dissatisfaction, a yearning for a fantasy that can never be truly fulfilled, except through the temporary solace of purchasing a more accessible branded item, like a lipstick or a keychain. The beauty of the couture image is therefore not an innocent beauty. It is a weaponized beauty, a tool of social and psychological control. It reinforces hierarchies, it polices the boundaries of taste, and it perpetuates a cycle of desire and disappointment that keeps the wheels of commerce turning. To admire a couture gown without a critical understanding of its ideological function is to be a willing participant in one's own subjugation. It is to accept the fantasy at face value, without questioning the power structures that it so elegantly conceals. The truly radical act is not to dismiss couture as irrelevant, but to stare directly at its beautiful, terrifying face, and to dissect the precise mechanisms by which it captivates and controls us. So where does this leave us? We are confronted with a system that is simultaneously anachronistic and hypermodern, artisanal and technological, exclusive and globally broadcast, commercially useless and economically essential. Haute couture is a living contradiction, a series of nested paradoxes. It is a ghost that has learned to operate a smartphone, a relic that has mastered the art of the viral loop. To try and resolve these contradictions, to arrive at a single, stable definition of what couture is in the 21st century, is to miss the point entirely. Its power, its resilience, its very essence lies in its ability to be all of these contradictory things at once. It is a shimmering, multifaceted object that reflects our own confused and contradictory desires back at us. It is a laboratory where the future of luxury is being beta tested, where new forms of value are being invented, and where the ancient art of seduction is being updated for the digital age. The story of haute couture is not the story of a dying art form. It is the story of a system of power that has achieved a kind of spectral immortality, a system that no longer needs a physical body to exert its influence. It exists as an idea, a standard, a myth. And in our secular, disenchanted world, myths are the most powerful and the most valuable commodities of all. The curtain does not fall on the couture show. It simply transforms into a screen, and the spectacle continues, endlessly, on the glowing surfaces of our devices, a beautiful and persistent ghost in the global machine. And this machine, let us be clear, is not a neutral conveyor of images. It is an active participant in the construction of couture's contemporary meaning. The algorithmic curation of social media feeds creates a new kind of couture canon, one determined not by the editors of legacy fashion magazines, but by the opaque logic of engagement metrics. A particular look from a Schiaparelli collection might achieve viral fame not because it represents the pinnacle of the couturier's art, but because its surreal, memeable quality plays well with the platform's preference for visually arresting, instantly shareable content. The algorithm, in this sense, becomes a new kind of critic, its judgments rendered in the cold, hard currency of likes and retweets. This has a feedback effect on the designers themselves, who are now, consciously or subconsciously, designing with the algorithm in mind. They are creating moments intended to be screen grabbed, looks designed to become digital talking points. This is a profound shift from a logic of materiality to a logic of virality. The success of a collection is measured not only by the orders placed in the salon, but by its digital footprint, its ability to permeate the cultural conversation. This transforms the couture object into a kind of Trojan horse. Its physical form is the vessel, but its true purpose is to deliver a payload of brand awareness into the sprawling, chaotic territory of the internet. The dress is a rumor that hopes to become a legend. This algorithmic pressure also intersects in fascinating ways with the globalization of the couture audience. The images of a Paris runway show are consumed instantaneously by a vast, heterogeneous global audience, each member of which interprets those images through their own cultural lens. A silhouette that might read as avant-garde in Paris could be interpreted as traditional in Tokyo or as provocative in Riyadh. This uncontrollable proliferation of meaning is both a challenge and an opportunity for the couture houses. On the one hand, it represents a loss of control over the brand's narrative. On the other, it allows the brand to signify different things to different tribes simultaneously. Couture becomes a floating signifier, a set of powerful but ambiguous symbols that can be adopted and adapted by diverse consumer cultures around the world. The phantom of couture, in this context, is a polyglot phantom, a ghost that speaks 1,000 different languages of desire. The brand's power lies in its ability to maintain a core identity while allowing for a multiplicity of interpretations, to be both rigidly defined and infinitely flexible. This is the central challenge of managing a global luxury brand in the 21st century, to project a singular, authoritative vision while catering to a fragmented, decentralized world of consumers. Let us also reconsider the body of the petite main, the supposedly sacred artisan at the heart of the couture myth. The romantic image is one of a serene, dedicated craftsperson, preserving ancient skills passed down through generations. The reality is often far more precarious. The economics of couture are brutal, and the ateliers are under immense pressure to produce ever more elaborate creations in ever shorter timeframes. The labor is intense, physically demanding, and often poorly compensated relative to the final price of the garment. The celebration of their craft can, in a darker light, be seen as a way to mystify and obscure the material conditions of their labor. By elevating them to the status of artists, the system distracts from their position as highly skilled but often vulnerable workers in a hyper-competitive global industry. The phantom of craftsmanship, so central to couture's identity, conceals the very real bodies and the very real labor that are required to produce the dream. And as technology enters the atelier, the nature of this labor is changing. The embroiderer may now have to collaborate with a programmer. The pattern cutter may have to learn to operate a CAD machine. These new skills are not always easily acquired, and they threaten to devalue the traditional, hand-based knowledge that was once the bedrock of the profession. The atelier is becoming a site of tension, a place where the deep-seated knowledge of the body clashes with the abstract knowledge of the machine, and where the future of artisanal labor is being negotiated, one stitch and one line of code at a time. This is the hidden, unglamorous backstage of the couture spectacle, a reality that is rarely, if ever, allowed to puncture the glossy, seamless fantasy presented to the public. To truly understand couture, we must look past the finished garment and see the complex and often fraught human ecosystem that brought it into being. We begin, then, not with a definition, but with a necessary dismantling. To speak of haute couture is to speak of a carefully constructed fiction, a legal and cultural fortress whose walls are maintained by a single, immensely powerful gatekeeper. It is not merely high dressmaking or expensive clothing. To suggest so is a profound category error, a failure to recognize the institutional machinery that animates the entire spectacle. Haute couture is a legally protected appellation of origin, a denomination as fiercely guarded as that of Champagne or Roquefort, and its control, its very essence, is legislated by the body once known as the Chambre syndicale de la haute couture, now subsumed into the larger entity of the Fédération de la haute couture et de la mode. This organization is not a mere trade guild or a friendly association of artists. It is a regulatory apparatus, a quasi-governmental authority that wields the power to bestow or withhold the most coveted title in the entire fashion ecosystem. It functions as both a sanctuary and a prison for creative expression, establishing a set of draconian, almost absurdly specific criteria that a fashion house, a maison, must meet to earn the right to call its work haute couture. The business of couture, therefore, is not the business of selling dresses. That is a vulgar misconception. The business of couture is the business of maintaining a myth of unparalleled artistry, unobtainable luxury, and uncompromising standards, a myth so potent that its aura, its halo, can consecrate and sell millions of derivative objects, from lipstick to handbags to sunglasses. The dresses themselves, the ostensible products, are in many ways the least important part of the commercial equation. They are the sacrificial artifacts, the relics presented on the altar of brand value, generating millions in earned media value, while often costing the houses millions in direct losses. This paradox sits at the very heart of our inquiry and must be endlessly interrogated. How can a business model predicated on financial loss be considered a success? The answer lies in understanding couture not as a commercial enterprise in the conventional sense, but as a sophisticated engine of symbolic production. The Chambre syndicale's rules are the engine's critical components. Consider the most foundational rule. To be an official member, a house must maintain an atelier, a workshop in Paris, and employ a minimum number of full-time technical staff, or petites mains, the little hands. On the surface, this appears to be a simple quality control measure, a guarantee of craftsmanship. But it is so much more. It is a geopolitical statement. It anchors the very concept of supreme fashion competence to a single city, re-inscribing Paris as the unassailable global capital of style. This is a form of cultural protectionism, a deliberate monopolization of prestige that dates back to the era of Louis XIV and his minister Colbert, who understood that the control of luxury goods was a powerful tool of statecraft. The rule is a barrier to entry, ensuring that the club remains exclusive, that the magic of the Made in Paris label cannot be easily replicated or democratized. It forces a massive overhead cost, immediately filtering out smaller, less capitalized talents and ensuring that the grand stage of couture is primarily occupied by heritage houses, backed by colossal luxury conglomerates like LVMH and Kering. It is a performance of authenticity, a declaration that true craft requires a specific geography, a specific lineage of labor, a claim that becomes ever more fraught in a globalized world where talent and technique are distributed far beyond the 8th arrondissement. Let us dissect this further. The requirement of an atelier in Paris is not merely logistical, it is ideological. It constructs a narrative of uninterrupted tradition, of skills passed down from master to apprentice, in a sacred, almost monastic space. It romanticizes the labor of the petites mains, those highly skilled artisans who might spend hundreds, even thousands of hours on a single garment. Yet this romanticization conceals a brutal economic reality. The value created by these artisans is not primarily captured in the price of the dress, a price that, high as it is, often fails to cover the cost of its own creation. Instead, their labor is alchemized into something far more abstract and far more profitable: brand equity. The photograph of a single, impossibly intricate beaded gown that circulates globally on social media and in glossy magazines serves as a testament to the house's creative genius and technical prowess. That image, that symbol, is what justifies the 4-figure price tag on a handbag manufactured in a far more industrialized setting, or the $100 price of a perfume whose liquid contents cost mere cents to produce. The couture atelier, therefore, functions as a laboratory and a theater. It is a space of genuine innovation where new techniques in draping, cutting, and embroidery are developed, but it is also a stage upon which the drama of artisanal authenticity is performed for a global audience. The Chambre syndicale, in mandating the existence of this Parisian stage, is not just preserving a craft, it is underwriting the very business model of modern luxury, a model based on the careful management of desire, a desire that is kindled by the spectacle of the impossible. And the spectacle is, itself, rigorously policed. Another key criterion set by the Chambre is the requirement to present a collection of a minimum number of original designs to the public twice a year, in January and July. The specific number of looks, or passages as they are called, has fluctuated over the years, but the principle remains the same. A house must demonstrate a consistent and substantial creative output. This rule establishes a relentless rhythm, a temporal discipline that structures the entire industry. It guarantees a constant stream of newness, of media moments, of opportunities to reinforce the brand's narrative. But it also creates a high-pressure environment of planned obsolescence, where even the most sublime creations have a tragically short public lifespan before the cycle demands they be replaced. Furthermore, the collections must include both daywear and evening wear, a stipulation that seems almost quaint in the 21st century. It speaks to a bygone era, to a fantasy of a client whose life is a structured series of high society events demanding distinct modes of dress. This rule reveals the fundamentally conservative and backward-looking nature of haute couture, even as it presents itself as the apex of fashion-forward innovation. It is selling a dream of a particular kind of life, a life of aristocratic leisure and ceremony, a life that has little resemblance to the reality of even its own hyper-wealthy clients. The institution, through its regulations, is not just defining what a couture garment is, it is implicitly defining the ideal life that such a garment is meant to inhabit. It is engaged in the business of social engineering through aesthetics. The client, of course, is the third crucial element in this triad of institution, creator, and consumer. The rules stipulate that a couture house must design made-to-order clothes for private clients, with one or more fittings. This is the very definition of bespoke, the antithesis of mass production. It conjures an image of intimacy, of a personal relationship between the designer and the wearer. But who is this client? The global cohort of active couture clients is estimated to be only a few thousand individuals. They are not merely wealthy. They represent a concentration of capital so extreme as to be almost unimaginable. They are the new global aristocracy, a transnational elite of heiresses, entrepreneurs, and royalty from emerging economies. For them, purchasing a couture garment is not like buying a piece of clothing. It is more akin to commissioning a work of art or acquiring a rare artifact. The transaction is shrouded in discretion and exclusivity. The fittings themselves are rituals of status and power. The client is not a passive consumer, but an active participant in the creation of her own unique object of desire, an object that will fit her body perfectly and will not be replicated for anyone else. Yet this relationship is also a fiction. The client is purchasing access to the brand's aura as much as she is purchasing a physical garment. She becomes a living ambassador for the house, her appearance at a gala or on a red carpet another vector for the dissemination of its symbolic power. The Chambre Syndicale's insistence on this private, bespoke model is what separates couture from even the most luxurious ready-to-wear. It preserves the fantasy of uniqueness and personal service, a fantasy that is essential for maintaining the price structure and perceived value of the entire luxury market. Without the couture client, the entire pyramid of luxury would lose its apex, and therefore its aspirational power. So we are confronted by a system that is profoundly uneconomical in its direct operations, yet wildly profitable in its indirect effects. This is the central genius of the haute couture model, as protected and curated by the Fédération. It is a form of institutionalized cognitive dissonance. The houses that participate in this system, particularly the larger ones, are not naive. They are masters of this double game. They understand that the millions spent on their couture collections are a marketing expense, an investment in the construction of a dream. Karl Lagerfeld was famously candid about this, admitting that Chanel's couture operation did not make money but was essential for the brand's image. The couture show is the most potent form of advertising imaginable because it does not appear to be advertising. It is presented as a cultural event, reviewed by art critics, and discussed in the language of aesthetic innovation. It generates a volume and quality of press coverage that no traditional advertising campaign could ever hope to achieve. This media frenzy elevates the brand name into the stratosphere of cultural significance, making the licensed products, the perfumes, the cosmetics, the eyewear, seem not like mass-market goods, but like accessible fragments of a sacred and exclusive world. The Chambre Syndicale's rules, by ensuring that the standards for entry into this world are impossibly high, effectively protect this marketing engine from dilution. It ensures that the spectacle remains sublime, the quality remains unimpeachable, and the myth remains intact. The business of haute couture is the business of laundering commerce through the medium of art, and the Chambre syndicale is the institution that sanctifies the process. Let us probe the ideology of craftsmanship that underpins this entire edifice. The term petites mains is itself a rhetorical device, a piece of deliberate myth-making. It translates to little hands, a diminutive, almost childlike term for what are, in reality, master artisans possessing decades of experience and a level of skill that is nothing short of breathtaking. There are different hierarchies within the atelier: the premier d'atelier who leads the workshop, the seconds, and the general seamstresses. There are specialized ateliers, some of which are owned by the major houses themselves, like Chanel's Perfection subsidiary, which has acquired legendary workshops like the embroiderer Lesage, the feathermaker Le Maurier, and the pleater Lognon, to ensure the survival of these unique savoir-faire. This vertical integration is a strategic move to control the means of symbolic production. However, the language used to describe this work, passion, artistry, magic, serves to obscure the material conditions of the labor itself. It is grueling, painstaking work that demands immense physical and mental discipline. By framing it as a calling rather than a job, the system deflects attention from questions of wages, working hours, and the potential for exploitation. The couture garment, when it finally appears on the runway, is presented as the singular vision of a genius designer, the creative director. The collective labor of the dozens of artisans who brought it into being is rendered invisible, subsumed under the signature of one name. This is the author function at work, a concept Foucault would recognize immediately. The designer's name becomes a brand, a guarantor of value, while the actual producers of that value remain anonymous, their hands fetishized but their individual identities erased. The Chambre's focus on the Parisian atelier reinforces this dynamic, creating a closed system where labor is venerated in the abstract but contained and controlled in the concrete. The evolution of the Chambre syndicale into the Fédération de la Haute Couture et de la Mode is also instructive. The name change itself signals a strategic adaptation to a changing world. It acknowledges the undeniable commercial and cultural power of ready-to-wear mode and menswear, bringing them under the same institutional umbrella as couture. This consolidation of power allows the Fédération to control the entire calendar of Paris Fashion Week, the most prestigious platform in the world. It creates a hierarchy, with haute couture positioned at the pinnacle, casting its glow over the more commercial weeks that follow. This structure is a brilliant piece of brand architecture. It allows the institution to leverage the historical prestige of couture to elevate the status of French ready-to-wear, creating a symbiotic relationship where each category reinforces the value of the other. The Fédération has also shown a degree of flexibility by creating different tiers of membership. Alongside the official members, there are correspondent members, foreign designers who show in Paris but do not meet all the stringent criteria, like Valentino or Giorgio Armani Privé, and guest members, younger or more experimental designers who are invited to show on the official calendar for a season. This tiered system allows the institution to refresh its image, to absorb new talent and stylistic innovations, without diluting the core brand of haute couture. It is a mechanism for managing change, for incorporating potential disruptions and making them part of the official narrative. It demonstrates that the institution is not a static relic, but a dynamic, adaptive organism, skilled in the art of self-preservation through controlled inclusion. It can appear open and forward-thinking, while simultaneously reinforcing the fundamental exclusivity and hierarchical structure that gives it its power. We must also consider the psychoanalytic dimension of this business. What is being sold is not a product, but a fantasy. The couture garment is an object of desire in the Lacanian sense. It represents the objet petit a, that which is perpetually sought but never truly attainable, the promise of a complete and unified self. The client who commissions a couture dress is not just buying fabric and thread. She is buying a piece of a fantasy identity, an idealized version of herself. The dress promises to transform her, to make her beautiful, powerful, desired. The entire ritual of the fitting, the obsessive attention to the minute details of her body, is a form of narcissistic validation. Yet this fulfillment is always temporary. The desire, once satisfied, immediately attaches itself to a new object, a new collection, a new look. This is the logic of the fashion system, and haute couture is its most potent and refined expression. The spectacle of the show, with its otherworldly models and impossible creations, is designed to provoke this sense of lack and longing in the audience. It presents a world of perfect beauty that is, by its very nature, exclusive and out of reach for the vast majority. This manufactured desire is the fuel that powers the entire luxury industry. The consumer who buys a Chanel lipstick is participating, in a small and mediated way, in the same fantasy structure. She is purchasing a token, a relic of the larger dream, a small piece of the unattainable object of desire. The business of haute couture is thus the business of managing the collective unconscious, of creating and directing the flows of symbolic desire on a global scale. The Chambre syndicale, in its role as the high priesthood of this secular religion, ensures that the liturgy remains pure and the idols remain sacred. Let us return to the raw economics and interrogate them with a more critical, even confrontational lens. The claim that couture is a loss leader is itself a carefully curated piece of corporate storytelling. It frames the enterprise in noble, almost altruistic terms, suggesting that these powerful corporations are acting as selfless patrons of the arts, sacrificing profit for the sake of preserving a precious craft. This narrative is, to put it mildly, disingenuous. An expense that generates billions of dollars in brand value, that serves as the primary marketing vehicle for an entire global empire of profitable goods, cannot accurately be described as a loss. It is a strategic investment with an astronomical return, just one that is realized indirectly on a different part of the balance sheet. To call it a loss is a rhetorical sleight of hand, a way of masking an exceptionally effective and predatory business strategy in the respectable language of cultural preservation. It allows the corporation to have it both ways, to reap the commercial benefits of the couture spectacle while simultaneously claiming the cultural cachet of being above mere commerce. This is the hypocrisy at the heart of the system. The Fédération, by maintaining its arcane and exclusive standards, is complicit in this obfuscation. It helps to sustain the illusion that art and commerce are separate realms, that the temple of haute couture is a sacred space unsullied by the profane logic of the market. But the temple was built by the market, it is sustained by the market, and its sole purpose is to serve the market. Furthermore, the system's insistence on a specific model of creativity, that of the singular genius artistic director, deserves our skepticism. This great man theory of fashion history is a convenient fiction that serves the interests of the brand. It creates a celebrity figurehead whose personal narrative can be easily mythologized and marketed. The reality of a modern couture house is that of a large, complex organization with teams of designers, researchers, merchandisers, and artisans all contributing to the final product. The creative director is more of a conductor than a solitary composer, an editor and a strategist who guides the collective effort and ensures that it aligns with the brand's overarching commercial and symbolic goals. But the myth of the lone genius is more powerful, more romantic, and ultimately more profitable. It allows the brand to personify its identity, to give it a human face. When a designer like John Galliano at Dior or Alexander McQueen at Givenchy created their most theatrical and fantastical couture shows, they were not just expressing a personal vision, they were performing the role of the tortured artist, the visionary madman, for the benefit of the brand. Their spectacles were immensely valuable because they reinforced the idea that the house was a site of true, unbridled creativity, a place where art happens. The Chambre syndicale's structure, which grants membership to a maison under the name of its founder or current designer, perpetuates this focus on the individual, further entrenching a model of authorship that conceals the collective and industrialized nature of modern fashion production. Let us consider the very materials of haute couture. The fabrics, the embroideries, the feathers, the jewels, they represent the pinnacle of material quality. But where do these materials come from? The supply chains of luxury are often as opaque as the client lists. The rare silks, the exotic leathers, the precious metals, their extraction and processing are part of a global system of resource allocation that is rarely discussed in the hushed tones of the couture salon. The system presents itself as the epitome of culture, yet it is utterly dependent on the raw materials of nature and the labor of a global workforce. The final garment, a sublime synthesis of craft and design, is the endpoint of a long and complex chain of production that is fraught with its own ethical and environmental questions. The beauty of the object serves to mystify its origins, to make us forget the material world from which it was summoned. This is the ultimate function of commodity fetishism, as described by Marx. The social relations of production are concealed behind the perceived value of the object itself. The couture gown is perhaps the most fetishized commodity of all, an object so saturated with symbolic meaning and aesthetic power that it seems to exist in a realm apart from the mundane world of labor and resources. The institutional framework, with its focus on the final act of creation in the Parisian atelier, actively participates in this process of mystification, drawing a curtain around the global network that makes the spectacle possible. The internal politics of the Chambre syndicale and the Fédération are also a critical area of inquiry, though one that is notoriously difficult to penetrate. The governing body is composed of representatives from the member houses themselves. It is, in effect, a cartel, an oligopoly that sets the rules for its own industry. This creates an inherent conflict of interest. The decisions made about which new designers to invite as guest members or how to adjust the official schedule are not made in a vacuum of pure aesthetic judgment. They are strategic business decisions that have significant implications for the competitive landscape of the luxury market. The established houses have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo, in protecting the barriers to entry that preserve their own dominance. While the inclusion of guest members can be seen as a gesture of openness, it can also be interpreted as a form of co-optation, a way to identify and neutralize potential rivals by bringing them into the official system, where they can be managed and controlled. The power of the Fédération is the power to define legitimacy. To be on the official calendar is to be recognized as a serious player. To be excluded is to be relegated to the margins. This power to include and exclude is the ultimate source of the institution's authority, an authority that it wields with calculated precision to shape the market in its own image. Consider the resilience of this seemingly anachronistic system. In an age of fast fashion, social media influencers, and a supposed democratization of style, how has haute couture managed to not only survive, but thrive? Its persistence is a testament to the enduring power of hierarchy and aspiration in a world marked by staggering and ever-increasing inequality. The more accessible fashion becomes at the lower end of the market, the more valuable extreme exclusivity becomes at the top. The digital age has not destroyed couture, it has amplified its power. An image of a couture gown can now be disseminated globally in an instant, reaching millions of people who will never see, let alone own, the physical object. The spectacle has been weaponized for the age of Instagram. The business model is perfectly suited to a media environment that privileges visual impact and viral moments. The couture show provides the content that feeds the endless cycle of digital media, generating a level of engagement that is the new currency of brand relevance. The Fédération has skillfully adapted to this new reality, embracing digital platforms and live streaming its shows, transforming an event once meant for a few hundred insiders into a global media spectacle. It is understood that the less accessible the product is, the more accessible the image of the product must be. This is the central paradox of modern luxury. Its commercial vitality depends on the endless, frictionless circulation of images of its own impenetrable exclusivity. Let's re-examine the criteria from another angle, that of a performance of a certain kind of institutionalized rationality. The specific numbers, a minimum number of employees, a minimum number of looks, are a way of bureaucratizing genius, of quantifying the unquantifiable. It imposes a modern, almost industrial logic onto what is supposed to be a pre-modern, artisanal practice. This is the logic of the modern state, of the census, of the survey. To be counted, to be measured, is to be made legible to power. A designer's creative vision is not enough. It must be validated by a set of objective, verifiable metrics. This process of quantification serves to rationalize the basis of couture's prestige, making it appear as if its value is derived from a set of clear, impartial standards, rather than from the more nebulous and subjective forces of tradition, taste, and market power. It is a way of legitimizing the institution's authority, of grounding its judgments in a language of objective fact. But these facts, these numbers, are not neutral. They are the product of a specific history and a specific set of interests. They are designed to produce a particular outcome, the preservation of a closed, hierarchical, and immensely profitable system. The apparent rationality of the rules masks the fundamentally arbitrary and political nature of the power they enact. The business of couture is also the business of producing and maintaining a very specific regime of truth. And this regime of truth has a profound effect on the very nature of creativity within the system. Is a designer who must produce at least 50 original looks, including both daywear and evening wear, for a presentation in Paris, twice a year, truly free? Or is he or she operating within a set of creative constraints so powerful that they predetermine the possible forms of expression? The system demands spectacle. It demands novelty. It demands a constant output of ideas that can be translated into media-friendly images. This can lead to a kind of aesthetic inflation, where designers are forced to become ever more extravagant, ever more theatrical, simply to capture the attention of a jaded and oversaturated media landscape. It can also lead to a kind of creative burnout, as the relentless pace of the calendar takes its toll. The history of couture is littered with cautionary tales of designers who have buckled under the immense pressure of this system. The very framework that is meant to celebrate and elevate creativity can also be the thing that crushes it. The laboratory of innovation can easily become a gilded cage. The patronage of the great luxury houses can feel like an artistic lifeline, but it comes with a set of golden handcuffs. The designer's name may be on the door, but the corporation's interests are on the balance sheet, and the Federacion's rulebook is on the table. This complex interplay of creative ambition, commercial pressure, and institutional regulation is the environment in which the contemporary couturier must operate, a tightrope walk between artistic integrity and the demands of the spectacle. Let us return, as we must, to the central paradox, the productive contradiction at the heart of this world. Haute couture must, to justify its existence, present itself as the absolute antithesis of the commercial fashion system. It is slow, not fast. It is bespoke, not mass-produced. It is artisanal, not industrial. It is timeless, not trendy. It is for the few, not the many. Yet, as we have seen, it is the secret engine of that very system. It is the sun around which the entire galaxy of commercial fashion revolves. Its values, its imagery, and its authority are what underwrite the logic of the entire market. The business of haute couture works precisely because it claims not to be a business at all. Its power lies in the strategic disavowal of its own economic function. The role of the Fédération de la Haute Couture et de la Mode is to act as the guardian of this disavowal, the high priest that maintains the sacred separation between the temple of art and the marketplace. But the walls of the temple are porous. The money changers are not just at the gates. They built the temple, they own the temple, and they are constantly renovating it to better suit their needs. Our task, as critical observers, is to see through this carefully constructed illusion, to recognize the institutional and economic machinery that lies hidden behind the shimmering facade of the runway, and to understand that in the world of haute couture, the most valuable creation is not the dress, but the myth. And it is a myth that continues to be fantastically, enduringly, and brutally profitable. The standards are not merely standards of quality. They are the bylaws of a corporation of dreams, a corporation whose primary business is the manufacturing of a desire so powerful it can convince the world that a piece of clothing is a work of art and that a brand is a form of cultural salvation. This entire edifice of rules and regulations, of ateliers in Paris and twice-yearly shows, is nothing less than the industrial constitution for the production of fantasy on a global scale.